Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Broccoli Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Becomes Dr. Octopus. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Foamy water crashed against the shore of the beach, drenching the massive conglomeration of sand-covered garbage in a fresh coat of salt water, adding onto the ever-forming layer of rust that encased the outside of any and all metallic objects in the area. Rats scurried between the massive spires of refuse, instinctively seeking shelter from the seagulls that swooped down from above, landing in search of food scraps to munch on. They too soon scattered back into the orange-hued sky as a lanky skeleton masquerading as a human trudged his way past the trash heaps, pulling a rusty, but still usable, wheelbarrow behind him. Its tire was entirely flat, one of the waterlogged wooden handles was split, and the barrow itself had several holes punctured throughout it due to a truly massive amount of rust. But it still functioned, stopping in the middle of what was best described as a crevice between the massive walls of trash on all sides. The man reached into the wheelbarrow and grabbed a slab of sheet metal he had bought from the store earlier, dropping it down onto the ground without much ceremony. He repeated the process until there was a mostly flat surface on the ground. Certainly there was enough space to suit his purposes. Dragging his mostly unused phone from his pocket, the man sighed as he looked at the time. The one he had been watching for the past week or so would be arriving soon. Quickly gathering another few slabs of sheet metal, the man jogged towards the dilapidated wooden ramp that connected the beach to the city behind it, allowing beachgoers an easy access point down from the dunes and into the waters below. Not that it really mattered, truth be told. No one came to this beach anymore, besides the man and he watched anyways. Slamming the sheet metal down, the man created a pathway from the beach ramp that connected all the way back to the previous clearing he had set up moments ago. Satisfied, he nodded and jogged away, leaving behind the wheelbarrow and the remaining bits of sheet metal with a small note that simply read, "For you, from a friend." The skeleton began to pick up his pace, eager to be gone from the area but desiring to remain close enough to see the boy's reaction. Finding a nicely sized bush just a short distance away, the man ran forward, crouched behind it, and pulled a small pair of binoculars from his exceptionally baggy cargo pants. A smile graced the skeleton's thin lips as he began to see the outline of the one he had been observing for a while now, in the distance. It definitely wasn't stalking, not in the slightest. It was the little things the man did that brought a smile to his heart, seeing true joy in the faces of others. That's not to say when he saved people he didn't see the same looks of joy, but it was different. There was little time for fanfare and hero work, at least in the heat of things, and when heroes and celebrities were pretty much synonymous, it became a bit confusing. Seeing the excited smiles of someone you just saved from being murdered asking you for an autograph can take away a bit of the majesty of the situation. No doubt they were happy to be alive, but the smile could come out forced or twisted. No one wants to look bad in front of a celebrity after all. For that reason, he liked to do these little acts of kindness, out of sight and out of mind. People wouldn't feel like they had to express their undying support and appreciation for the one who assisted them, and the skeleton got to see the smiles he so desperately wanted everyone to have on their face. That was why he had observed the child for so long before deciding to step in and lend a helping hand. He'd never seen a smile on the boy's face, not once, in all the time he'd spent observing him. It wasn't stalking, really. Still, it was quite obvious why he wasn't happy, and the skeleton had fixed it. The poor boy couldn't make it down onto the beach with all that sand in the way. It'd impede his mobility. So, when he saw the green-haired boy he'd been observing for the past week reach the beach ramp with a large bruise on his face and tears rolling down his eyes, the skeleton felt the spot where his stomach used to be plummet. The fact that his wheelchair looked like someone had taken a baseball bat to it as well, with its bent wheels, missing handlebar and similarly missing armrest, its footrests also wildly bent out of shape, his smile disappeared too. It nearly came back when he saw the child look down the ramp in wonderment at the pathway now laid out before him in the sand, finally allowing the boy access to the beach he could only previously stare at longingly, confined to the paved sidewalk above the dunes where his wheelchair could safely traverse. But it wasn't quite enough. Standing up from his hiding place amongst the bushes, the man briskly walked back over to the beach ramp even as the child somehow managed to force his battered chair down the rickety walkway, its bent wheel still obeying the commands sent to it by the boy pushing forward on the electric chair's joystick. The mop-headed child had gotten to the bottom of the walkway by the time the skeleton reached it, and was tentatively about to cross the threshold of rotten wood onto sandy sheet metal before a bony hand came to rest upon the child's own, somewhat similarly skinny hand. He should have asked the child to politely stop. He should have asked the important questions, like what happened to his chair, or what happened to his face. But one look at his eyes up close told the skeleton all he needed to know. The kid wasn't going to answer anything without clamming up. He already looked like he was about to have a panic attack. So, the skeleton did what he always did when he saw someone who felt unsure, or scared, or nervous. He smiled. "Hello, my boy," he spoke softly at first, trying to sound reassuring. The same voice one might use when talking to a child who broke something inconsequential for the first time, and was far more scared of the consequences than the situation warranted. Patting the bent wheel of the chair, he joked, "Why don't I give you a bit of a push across this pathway here, HRM? Wouldn't want this bucket of bolts to get stuck and wind up as part of this beautiful landscape. Now would we?" There was a pause. 1,000 things flashed behind those exceptionally bright viridian eyes as the child stared into the sunken blue orbs of the skeleton, searching for the hidden meaning behind the words. The boy wasn't stupid. He knew anybody with eyes could clearly tell what had happened. The true question was, why would anyone care? He knew from the skeleton's smile that he was avoiding it on purpose. Not because he didn't care, but because he was intelligent. He understood. If he managed to get all the way down to the beach in this situation, no one else cared enough to do anything about it. For what reasons could be debated upon later. Right now he didn't need that information. He simply understood that the cat wouldn't be coming out of the bag without a fight. The boy flashed a watery smile, sniffling as more tears traveled down his face. "Thank you." It was simple, to the point, and conveyed the necessary information to the skeleton. It was both an acknowledgement of the situation, and additionally served as acceptance towards the man's offer. Nodding, he got behind the child and placed one hand on the remaining handlebar and another on the seemingly burnt leather backing of the chair. Why was it singed? It looked like an explosion had gone off on the chair from this angle. "Wipe those tears off, my boy. You'll hardly be able to see the ocean if you've already got one in your eyes." A mix between a few sobs, a hiccup, and a chuckle escaped the mouth of the child, who nodded his head downwards, pointing it to the yellow backpack on his lap. The small metallic pin of All Might on the bag nearly kept the smile on his face for a little longer. But looking at how the bag appeared to have been through an explosion and then tossed through an industrial meat grinder, it was all the skeleton could do to keep from frowning further. I want tea to be but," he stuttered, unsure of how to voice his issue. It was always hard explaining his quirk to others. "And my tea tissues are right there after all be but. I see can't move my arms." "My boy," the skeleton started, and sighed. He was going to have to ask at this point if it was that bad. "It's my quirk." The skeleton's eyes widened at the sudden shout, and then widened even further as he observed what appeared to be white strands of wet spaghetti pop up from under the boy's collar on his school uniform. He idly wondered if the boy got in trouble for popping his collar up like that and not keeping it folded. The skeleton had seen popped collars on jackets and shirts all over the place in America, but it wasn't really in style in Japan. Still, there were more pressing matters at hand, namely oddly mobile spaghetti dancing on the boy's neck. "And my cute quirk isn't really special," he began, the noodles sliding back underneath the protection of the boy's popped collar. Perhaps that was why he kept it popped. The noodles were visible on the back of his neck and he wanted to keep it covered. Shaking his head, the skeleton grunted, acknowledging the boy's remark. Nodding himself, the boy continued. Aye. The boy began, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves before continuing, thankfully without as much of a stutter. "I have complete control over the nervous system in my body. I can rapidly grow it, expand it, tie it in knots, and make it exit my body." The skeleton blinked. This was related to the issue. How exactly? "As you can see, I'm a bit stuck in this wheelchair. I had an accident when I was younger and my neck was broken. I broke my neck. The accident. Completely severed my spinal cord from the neck down." At this point, the skeleton had very nearly reached his self-made clearing, but had slowed to a complete stop at the boy's admission. Severed from the neck down, but he was piloting his electric wheelchair just fine. hand, the boy mumbled, causing the skeleton to stare down at the boy's arms. One of them was just hanging limply at his side, next to the non-bent wheel on the left side of his chair, no longer supported by the now missing armrest. Casting his gaze to the right side, the man was somewhat surprised to notice that the child's hand was actually lightly tied to the chair itself, a small cotton string keeping his wrist bound to the remaining armrest. His fingers splayed outwards on it. As he observed, he noticed the white noodles he had seen coming from the boy's back emerged from the tips of his fingers, moving forward to press what remained of his chair's toggle forward, eliciting a similar movement from the busted chair as it struggled to obey its orders. Before the skeleton could voice the exceptionally large number of questions that were now floating in his head, the boy spoke once again. "A good thing about my quirk is that, since I can control my nervous system, I can stop sensory information from traveling to my brain. So I can stop myself from feeling pain. It's why I can extend and manipulate my nervous system kind of like an appendage. And not that it can do much really. Nerves don't really have muscle strength to back them up. J just pushing F forward on my C-chair's joystick. I is a P pretty big strain. More questions than answers continued to pop up within the skeleton's mind. But he was able to still lightly push the once again mobile chair forward, and finally entered into the clearing he had created, isolated from the rest of the world thanks to the mountains of trash that surrounded them on all sides. He just wanted to allow the child the chance to drive his electric wheelchair onto the beach so he could observe the waves up close. How did things come to this? After the accident, the first thing I tried to do was reconnect the remains of my N nervous system W with the severed B bit. The child mumbled, catching the attention of the skeleton once again as he struggled to process all the information being thrown onto him. But I don't know. C couldn't figure it out. It's not like there's a S slot or something W where I can just plug my nerves back into. Satisfied that the child seemed to be alright in the center of his makeshift clearing, and not rolling away due to any slight incline, the skeleton allowed himself to circle around to the front of the chair and sat himself down on the sheet metal, staring expectantly at the child in a clear invitation to continue. He really did try to keep the smile on his face. The green-haired kid took another short, shaky breath as he steadied himself, the skeleton just now truly observing the form of the child in front of him. Actually, looking at it, studying him. He was a bit on the skinny side, but the skeleton supposed that was to be expected. He didn't look starved or anything. He could probably stand to eat a bit more, but the clear lack of any and all muscle definition certainly exacerbated the problem. Still, it may have stood to reason, being confined to a wheelchair and apparently unable to move anything at all from the neck down would certainly make things like eating, much less exercise, exceptionally difficult. He'd never observed the kid in depth before, just noticed he came down to the beach every day after school, stayed at the top of the entryway ramp, and frowned. He'd never truly noticed how immobile the kid was. He seemed to be able to swivel his head around pretty good, and to mostly have a full range of motion there, but the rest of him was just limp. It didn't budge. The skeleton nearly gasped as he remembered the boy's limply hanging arm, no longer having an armrest to support it and simply hanging uselessly off to the side. Without even thinking, he had grabbed the arm and gingerly placed it onto the boy's lap, tucking it underneath the backpack so it wouldn't be going anywhere. The boy smiled. The skeleton found himself unable to return it. I know how it L looks, and how this is going to S sound. But why you really J just caught me on a B bad day. The skeleton found himself staring back at the boy, fully ready to issue a rebuttal and quite possibly release a few scathing words of his own before the boy spoke once more. We both know what H happened to me today. B, but it's N, not like this is N normal. And no one else cared about me B because I actually am pretty accident P prone. He began, a small chuckle escaping from his lips. I actually B busted up my old W wheelchair W way worse than this when I took it down a S skateboard ramp a few months ago. After what felt like eternity to the man, a small smile was able to grace itself upon the lips of the skeleton. Normally he would have been pretty suspicious, and he most certainly still was, but this kid really didn't seem to have the capability to lie. If there was one thing the skeleton prided himself upon, it was his ability to read others. While the kid's body may be limp and immobile, those large, bright, viridian eyes sparkled and gleamed in just the right way to let the skeleton know that this kid wasn't perfect. He had a slew of problems beyond just his status as a quadriplegic. His currently battered physical state was a sign of it as well. But he also saw hope, curiosity, a fiery passion that burned right behind the child's eyes, a sure sign of some long-held conviction that had never been given up, despite having innumerable obstacles thrown in the way. This kid was a fighter. Yagi. The child's smile disappeared, replaced with an expression of confusion. My name, Yagi Toshinori. Once again standing, the skeleton leaned over and placed a bony hand upon the child's small shoulder. The act of reassurance met with a small smile. Hello, Iwu, Midoriya. Midoriya Izuku. The green-haired child stammered out, averting his eyes from the skeleton's own. Suddenly, his eyes widened and the teen's gaze shot down to his immobilized hand. Toshinori's gaze soon followed and observed as the child's nervous system, which had sprouted from his fingertips, attempted to tug backwards on his wheelchair's toggle, succeeding in the endeavor he might add. But no movement was elicited from the machine. The wheels twitched a bit, but they didn't seem to be budging at all, and a quick glance at the ground around the tires confirmed they weren't stuck on anything. I think my B battery is dying. Toshinori thought the more logical explanation would be that the child's wheelchair had finally given up, the clear abuse it suffered finally taking a toll and draining the last bit of life from the device. He could already see clear fright cross through the child's eyes as they darted around the beach, unsure of how to continue. The child mumbling at about a mile a minute about getting home on time and something about homework gave a few hints to the skeletal man as well. He supposed it was only natural, however. Without that chair, the boy was, as rude and as awful as it was to think it, about as mobile as a sack of potatoes. Toshinori tried to squeeze the kid's shoulder lightly to drag his attention back towards the man, but his efforts were ignored. Wait, the kid was paralyzed. He probably couldn't feel anything at all below his neck. Young Midoriya, wide, frantic green eyes snapped up to electric blue as Toshinori gave a reassuring smile to the child. Please, allow me to bring you home. I have my truck nearby. We can easily load your chair in the back, he explained, jerking his thumb over his shoulder, pointing to some unseen location behind the mounds of trash. The skeletal figure held up a hand to stop the complaints and protests about to spew outwards from this Midoriya child's mouth, his piece unfinished. Think on it for a bit. You did just get here after all. Come, relax, enjoy the beach. I imagine it's been a while since you've been this close to the ocean, he finished, arms spread wide to gesture to the majesty of the ocean behind him, the setting sun casting a beautiful reddish-orange reflection across the seawater, tinting it with new colors. He nearly coughed up some blood as he remembered all the trash that impeded the view, but it was a little bit late for that tidbit of information to stop him. Still, when the child smiled with even more tears welling up from the corner of his eyes, another beautiful smile gracing his lips, Toshinori knew he had managed to say all the right things. The boy merely nodded and gracefully closed his mouth, turning his watery gaze outwards towards the horizon. Toshinori stood by the child's side, hand on his shoulder, as he too gazed outwards, his thoughts flittering about much like the birds that soared across the sky. The very fleeting thought of passing on his quirk to the child before him flashed through his mind. But the skeleton quickly squashed it. Firstly, he didn't know the boy all that well, but he did understand that he possessed a drive, and a powerful one at that. He had seen it in the child's eyes. He readily admitted to himself that if the boy wasn't as immobilized as he was, he might have considered trying to push the child into considering hero work. Not that that ever really needed to happen. Everyone had dreams of being a hero at some point, and Toshinori was sure the boy was no different. With Midoriya's current state, however, if his quirk came with a healing factor, Toshinori would have been sorely tempted to relinquish it to the boy then and there, but sadly, fate seemed to be playing a cruel game. The skeletal man knew that One for All had the capability of boosting the strength of its user's own quirks. His predecessor and former master's quirk, Float, while initially fairly weak, became tantamount to a flight quirk after being gifted One for All. The child didn't seem to have the capability to regenerate the damaged tissue, however, even though he demonstrated the ability to seemingly create more of it, and even expand it through his body. The words Midoriya spoke earlier rang out through his mind. It's not like there's a S slot or something W where I can just plug my nervous system into. It all clicked within Toshinori's mind. The child had the ability to create more nerves from the remaining, unsevered, healthy tissue that resided within his neck, but the severed nerves below his injury were beyond saving. When the boy mentioned how he couldn't just plug his nervous system back into itself, he must have meant two things. Firstly, and most obviously, he tried to just jam his healthy nerves into the damaged ones and go from there. If that didn't work, which it quite obviously didn't, the boy most likely attempted to simply grow his nervous system out like the original and replace the entire thing with a brand new, healthy version. But, as he mentioned, it wasn't like he could just plug it in. How would a child know how to attach nerve cells into muscle cells, or form any of the various intricate, microscopic connections that even Toshinori hadn't the faintest of ideas about? Biology was never Toshinori's strong suit, but he understood that the body was an incredibly complex machine. Tacking wild and wacky quirks onto the already complicated subject was tantamount to an unsolvable riddle. The second glaring issue with providing the child with his quirk was his physical state. Quite frankly, the child wouldn't be able to handle the sheer power of One for All. He was far too frail. The only reason Toshinori was able to contain it was because his body had years to adjust to the massive amounts of power coursing through his veins. And even though his current true form was that of an emaciated skeleton, he was able to utilize his quirk to bulk his body back up to its original form, if only for short periods of time. There was simply no way the similarly skeletal Izuku would be able to handle the power without blowing his limbs off. Toshinori nearly punched himself in the face as he idly thought that it didn't really matter, since the kid didn't really have a use for his limbs anyways. But it did highlight the second issue with his weak body. It would be nearly impossible to bulk up, and then maintain that bulk. Through no fault of his own, Midoriya was immobile. He wouldn't be able to gain much muscle without serious assistance, and even then, there was no guarantee that One for All's quirk-boosting capabilities would be sufficient to allow the boy to either reattach his damaged nerves to his healthy ones, or create a new, functional nervous system. Toshinori's eyes narrowed. It didn't matter if the child couldn't inherit his quirk. He already had a candidate in mind for that anyways. But he wasn't just going to forget about this kid. The look in his vibrant eyes, the bright smile, it all reminded him of himself. He was going to help this kid out. How? He'd figure that out later. He already had a few ideas floating around his skull. He could probably pay Powerloader to rig up a nice wheelchair for the kid. That could make for a pleasant surprise. Make sure to have the joystick be extra sensitive. Maybe have a space in the armrest for his arm to sit inside so it didn't need to be tied in place. Yeah, that could work. A startled gasp jerked Toshinori out of his thoughts as the kid frantically looked down at his back. A few tendrils of his nervous system shooting out of his neck like needles and diving inside the yellow pack. He frowned as he noticed the small amount of blood coating the tips of the mobile nerves, further cementing the fact that the kid didn't have any regenerative capabilities. He was simply abusing his immunity to pain in order for his nervous system to literally cut its way out from under the confines of his skin. Please, let me. What do you need? Toshinori inquired. Resting his hand on the destroyed back, the child hesitated, staring up at the man, before casting his gaze downwards and retracting the nerves back inside his body. And my phone. I keep a backup one in the front right pocket of my bag. It's not like a regular phone. It's one of those Bluetooth earbud things. Very tiny. Toshinori nodded, understanding the boy's meaning. It wasn't as if the kid would be able to manipulate a phone around in order to utilize it properly. Or could he? He'd have to ask what his nervous system was capable of doing later. All he knew right now was the boy said it was a small struggle to just push forward on his wheelchair's joystick. The skeleton frowned as he fished the earpiece out of the bag, or at least all 5 pieces of what remained of it. The device, much like the bag, had been destroyed. Toshinori grabbed his own phone out of his pocket and nodded at the boy, just now noticing how dark it had become. The sun had finally set moments ago, and the crisp night blew around them, the only illumination available being the moonlight reflecting off the ocean's surface. I presume you have stayed out later than intended. The boy nodded and sagged his head, clearly ashamed. He flinched back, but didn't protest, when a bony hand found its way inside the tangled green mess atop his head, ruffling the hair around. Don't fret, young Midoriya, I have done the same. I didn't realize just how late it was. If you give me a number I can call home and explain the situation. He offered, phone still in his offhand. Before the boy could protest, the skeleton added on to his argument. Would you be capable of holding a conversation with your parents in a state like this? The boy sagged further in his chair, but didn't disagree. Instead, he mumbled out a series of numbers that the skeleton dialed into his keypad, before pressing the talk button and placing the speaker to his ear. The device rang 4 times before it was picked up, a shaky female voice emanating outwards from the speaker. Hello. This is Inko Midoriya speaking. I'm sorry, but this isn't really the best time for Mrs. Midoriya. Hello, my name is Toshinori Yagi, and I was just calling to inform you that I have your son with me here, safe and sound. He heard what sounded like a cup shatter on the ground as soon as the words left his mouth, and he was forced to pull the phone away from his ear as the woman all but screamed through the speaker. You have my baby boy. Is he all right? Where are you? What's going on? Mrs. Midoriya, please. Toshinori stammered. It was always hard talking to parents whenever their kids were involved. It was one of the many things he was not looking forward to doing with his new job as a teacher. I assure you that young Midoriya is fine. I was just about to take him home. As for why he was out so late, I must apologize for my actions, as they are the reason for your son's tardiness. He noticed Izuku look up at him, a questioning tinge flashing across his eyes. Go on. The phone buzzed. The Midoriya matriarch temporarily placated. Breathing out the air Toshinori had been unaware he was holding in, he continued. I've noticed your son coming down to the beach after school, but never venturing down past the walkway. Toshinori felt he didn't need to explain why the boy never ventured down, and the child didn't seem to be horrified or bothered by his admission of the boy's travels to the beach. So he felt assured that the mother was aware in some capacity of her son's movements. Yes, Izuku always did like the beach when he was younger. Toshinori frowned at the tone of voice with which the mother spoke, but he understood the meaning. Izuku liked to go to the beach when he was younger and mobile. Yes, well, I felt that the boy should be allowed to get a closer look, as it were. So I was here today building a small walkway for your son's wheelchair to travel across. He tried to keep his face straight. He really did. He was trying to be serious. But the way the boy looked at him and smiled when he heard that it was this skeletal matchstick man that had labored away just to make a pathway for a wheelchair-bound child. It was too much. Toshinori grinned. It quickly disappeared as he realized he had zoned out for a bit. He hadn't he? He didn't recall hearing anything coming out of the phone's speaker, but it had undoubtedly been at the very least several long seconds since the woman on the other end spoke. His palms started to sweat. He did not want to ask the woman to repeat herself. What? The speaker buzzed. Now it was Toshinori's turn to pause for a few seconds. He had to repeat himself. Was he not clear? I built a small walkway for your son's wheelchair. Could you put Izuku on the phone, please? The skeletal man quickly complied, offering the phone to the young man beside him. For the second time that day, he just about punched himself in the face as he quickly slapped the button that turned on the speakerphone in a desperate attempt to cover his mistake as a deliberate action. The boy stared at the phone with wide green eyes before swallowing, clearly nervous about the prospect of talking with his no doubt furious mother. After another second, he did manage to gather the courage to speak. Hi Mom. I am alright. I'm just at the beach with Mr. Yagi. And my chair's battery died. There was quite the audible sigh of relief, slightly tinged with static as the phone translated the sound. Izuku, you should just call me if that happens. I could come pick you up. You can still press the buttons on your earpiece with your nerve. Pork, right, she complained, not satisfied with the answer. My earpiece broke, as so did my B backup. Izu, not to worry. Toshinori quickly cut into the conversation. He himself wanted to leave the beach, and he could tell that this conversation wasn't going to end anytime soon at this rate. Setting his phone down upon the lap of the green-haired boy, he turned and began to drag the wheelchair behind him as he left the metallic walkway and trudged through the sand, precious cargo still inside the chair. By itself, the chair likely would have gotten caught in the sand, unable to gain the traction necessary to move itself forward. Due to being dragged by the surprisingly strong skeleton, however, there was little to no issue in pulling the boy behind him as Toshinori made his way towards his truck. I'm heading back to my truck right now, and we'll chuck his chair in the back. Your son can give me directions to your house along the way. Toshinori butted back into the conversation before the woman could object further. Fear not, Mrs. Midoriya. I shall leave my phone on for the entire ride. We can continue to talk, and you can hear the directions your son provides and correct him should he be wrong. Besides, I can't imagine your son lives very far from Dagaba if he comes here every day after school, he assured. Despite this, he could practically hear the mother gritting her teeth as she debated through the obvious actions of just heading down herself, calling the police, or some other unknown option. Eventually, however, he heard another tired, static-filled sigh as the mother relented. Toshinori walked over to the passenger side of his truck, opening the door and rapidly stuffed a Silver Age hero costume that rested on the passenger seat into the glove box, before turning and, as gently as possible, lifting the green-haired teen from his wheelchair seat to set him down in the car seat. Taking a few liberties, he adjusted his legs and arms a bit in a way he felt looked comfortable, and was rewarded for his actions with a small smile and a nod. Lastly, he placed his phone on the dashboard as he buckled the child in and closed the door, moving on to the task of securing the wheelchair in his truck bed. Idly, he could hear a few pieces of conversation between the boy and his mother as he hefted the chair into the back, laying it down on its side and sliding around a few pieces of scrap metal and other junk he had liberated from around the beach to stabilize it. At one point, the chair probably could have been folded up to be more compact, but it seemed a bit too damaged to attempt that at the moment. Satisfied it wasn't going to be flying out the back of his truck bed, he wasn't planning on going onto the highway after all. He circled back around to the front and climbed inside, slid his key into the ignition, buckled himself in, and drove off. He engaged in a bit of idle conversation along the way, mostly just a few formalities and explanations as for Toshinori's behavior, in addition to occasional directions from Izuku. The mother seemed oddly emotional that the man had decided to build a walkway for her son. Perhaps he should have taken a few pictures of the path he'd made. It wasn't as if it was difficult. He literally just threw down a bunch of metal on the ground and let the sand hold it in place. On the bright side, the mother did ease up considerably as the drive went on, as she began to infer that the man was indeed driving her son back to his home, and not like kidnapping him. He would never go for that, however. Only villains do that. Sure enough, after about 10 or so minutes he had pulled into the parking lot of a fairly nondescript, beige apartment building. Not run down, not anything special though either. Likely the family was lower middle class. Despite having just pulled into the parking lot, Toshinori could already see the boy's mother power walking towards the car, having quickly exited from a bottom floor apartment. Well, he assumed this was the boy's mother anyways. The resemblance was uncanny. She was seemingly middle-aged, maybe in her 40s, with a somewhat lean figure with just a bit of weight on her, but not nearly enough to ever be considered chubby. He could practically see the muscle just underneath the surface of her arms. Still, it once again stood to reason. She likely had to pull a lot of weight, quite literally, around the house, and was probably responsible for taking care of Midoriya's everyday life, since he couldn't move around himself. Well, her and her husband anyways. Toshinori had just barely stepped out of the car and closed the door before he suddenly felt his feet lifted off the ground and the air in his one remaining lung squeezed out of him by two deceptively powerful arms. "Thank you for returning my precious baby boy," was additionally shouted at a volume loud enough to put present Mike to shame, directly in Toshinori's ear. Unfortunately, all of this startled the skeletal man something fierce, and while he had been proud that he'd managed not to cough up any blood at the beach earlier, it all came spraying out full force at this point in time. The fact that one of the woman's hands had tightly smashed itself into his old wound when she hugged him certainly contributed to the sheer volume of it. As quickly as he was picked up, he was dropped, as the woman backed away with fright in her eyes and blood on her arms. Toshinori could only idly process that information, however, as he was a bit busy kneeling down on the ground, spitting up the rest of the crimson liquid that forced itself out of his mouth. He never liked it when others saw him vulnerable like this, not only because it was a reminder of his shame, his weakness, but because it took away the smiles anyone had on them at the time. It wasn't a pretty sight to witness anyone coughing up blood. But when those people recognized that it was the #1 hero himself that was vomiting the red liquid, well, let's just say that he hated the looks of pity, the sad eyes. He didn't work as hard as he did to become the #1 hero to be greeted with the same sad smile one would give to their dying grandfather in a nursing home. That's all he was now, though, he supposed, a dying relic of times past. As much as he hated to admit it, his wound was killing him. He winced as he recalled the words of his numerous doctors, how happy they had been, how they smiled and told him he was only dying slowly, as if that was a consolation prize. True, he wasn't dying anytime soon. He had quite a few years left inside him, probably 15 minutes, 20 of them. It was a good amount of time, more than enough to go and live the life of a civilian at some point after he eventually retired. Perhaps it was just knowing that he was going to eventually die of malnutrition or organ failure that upset him. That was what he was told. He had to keep taking in vital nutrients and get the stuff necessary for his body to keep working, or he'd just literally starve to death. If that didn't get him, well, eventually his heart or remaining lung would just give out, the two organs already working overtime as it was. Currently, he was only barely meeting the requirements his doctors had laid out for him. Eating was a painful experience. It saddened him as well that he could no longer eat his favorite foods either, nor in the large quantities he used to enjoy. Gone were the days of getting kicked out of all-you-can-eat buffets by angry owners. Now he cooked for one and still somehow managed to get leftovers for 2 days from it. A shaky hand rested on his back, snapping Toshinori out of his daze. Casting his sunken gaze behind him, he noticed the extremely concerned look of the Midoriya matriarch, trying and failing to hold back her own tears at the skeleton's situation. Or perhaps it was her son's. Toshinori noted that her gaze kept flickering back and forth from him and the concerned boy in the passenger seat, who he could vaguely hear yelling something over the ringing in his ear. His mind still muddled a bit from the sudden shout. No doubt the mother had noticed the boy's bruised face, or perhaps his totaled wheelchair. "Why, you asked me why I assisted your son on the car ride back," the skeleton stated, drawing the mother's attention back to his lanky form. Standing up, he wiped the remaining trails of blood from the corner of his mouth and turned to face the clearly shaken woman. "Let's just say, he's not the only one here with his own health problems." The green-haired mother still looked shaken. Her blood-covered hand trailed down the man's similarly soaked arm and grabbed his angular hand. Looking into the truck, he could see the boy looked just as shaken, terrified by the sight he had witnessed. Sighing, Toshinori reached into his pocket and pulled out a few napkins and some hand sanitizer, something he'd found was nice to carry around in public spaces. "It's not your fault, I assure you. This just happens every once in a while. Yes, I am receiving medical care for it. It's just something I have to live with now. And yes, I have practiced this speech." Just as the mother and son's mouth had opened up, they both quickly clicked shut. Toshinori busied himself with cleaning the woman's skin off as best he could, but was unable to clean the fabric stain with the crimson liquid. A quick squirt of hand sanitizer, and the woman was looking marginally less mortified than she had been a few moments ago. "Go get your son. It's all right." He smiled, praying to the gods that he had wiped all the blood off his teeth with his tongue. One had to have a large, genuine smile when trying to be reassuring, after all. The mother's frowning visage informed him that he had failed. Still, she nodded, pulling her hand away from the skeletons and walking around to the passenger side, opening the door and scooping up the poor boy in her strong arms. She briskly walked back over to their apartment and pushed the door open with her foot, carrying the child inside and away from Toshinori's view. Toshinori shuddered as he trudged to the back of his truck, taking care to not step in the puddle of blood that now rested in the parking lot. He quickly freed the battered wheelchair from the back and set the contraption down on the ground, beginning to push the device over towards the apartment. About halfway to the door, the woman reappeared in a new, bloodless shirt and marched forward with a determined expression. He noticed she was pushing an empty wheelchair in front of her. "You, sit," the woman commanded, staring with frightened eyes at the skeleton man. Still, those eyes held the same determination he recognized in the child on the beach. A drive, a passion, a motherly compulsion that Toshinori knew she'd never ignore. And that compulsion was to not take no for an answer. He was going to refuse, he really was. But before he could even open his mouth to protest, the woman held out her open palm towards the man, and then closed it, almost as if she was squeezing a stress ball, all while pulling her arm back towards her body. The second she did, Toshinori found himself stumbling forward, pulled by some unknown force, and quickly pivoted on his heels so his face wouldn't crash down into the chair. With a light thud, the skeleton was surprised to find himself sitting inside the wheelchair, as the woman began tugging on one of the handlebars, dragging him back inside the family apartment in an almost exact replica of how Toshinori had earlier dragged young Midoriya back towards his truck on the beach, casting his gaze away from the steely glare of the mother, who was currently busy attempting to burn a hole through her apartment's door with her eyes alone. The skeletons redirected his sight to what was occurring in front of him, slightly surprised to find the young man's beat-up wheelchair being pulled behind them as well through some unseen force, most likely the work of this woman's quirk, no doubt some form of telekinesis. Resigning himself to this fate, he sunk back into the chair and allowed himself to be dragged inside, not even bothering to try and stand up from the chair when the woman had left him inside their small living room to go and close the front door. To his left, he could see the boy giving him a small, apologetic smile from his position on a rather plain-looking couch, his arms folded together across his lap, and a pillow on both his sides, perhaps to stop him from falling over. Toshinori's gaze shot back towards the entryway when he heard the front door close, with far more force than was necessary to achieve such an outcome. He shuddered again. Hell hath no fury like an upset mother. The mother didn't acknowledge the two men cowering in the room, instead simply marching into the kitchen and pulling an ice pack and a hand towel out of the freezer before finally coming back into the living room and sitting down next to her son. Izuku's position was changed once more, as the mother manipulated the boy so he'd be lying down beside her, his head on a pillow, allowing the woman to simply place the towel-wrapped ice pack on the large purple bruise atop the boy's forehead. This elicited a small hiss, but otherwise he offered no other forms of resistance. The boy averted his gaze from his mother's, unwilling to look her in the eye. Toshinori could only feel pity in his stomach, or where his stomach used to be. He had been paralyzed, immobilized by villains before while they decided to regale him with their master plan, tragic backstory, or some other asinine monologue. But this kid, he was stuck like that constantly. He wasn't going to get over it. When he was about to get yelled at by his own mother, the boy didn't even have the capability of considering the idea of running. He simply couldn't. He just had to sit there. If you try and pass this off as reckless driving with your wheelchair, Izuku, the mother began, her voice dangerously low. But Toshinori could see it in her eyes, the tears beginning to well up, her quivering lip. The angry mother facade was rapidly slipping. It doesn't matter, Mom. See, the non-disclosure agreement does not apply to any new incidents, the woman screeched, causing both men in the room to shrink away from the furious woman. Just as quickly as the anger flared, the woman had thrown herself across her baby, hugging him tightly into her chest and crying into his hair. The boy mimicked her actions with gusto. Non-disclosure agreement. As Toshinori began piecing together the puzzle that was Izuku Midoriya, he found himself upset as he noticed that it was getting bigger and bigger. Every time he completed some section of the design, more pieces appeared and he had to somehow make it all fit together correctly. He was paralyzed from the neck down by an accident, and the skeleton was willing to bet that it was directly caused by someone. As for whether it was an accident or not, well, Toshinori was fairly certain that whoever did this hadn't meant to cause such serious damage. Quite frankly, just seemed like an exceptionally unfortunate case of quirk misuse in the child's younger years, which was sadly becoming more and more common as time went on. Due to the nature of quirks manifesting suddenly and randomly at, generally speaking, around age 4, preschools could be quite the dangerous place. School was risky when any number of your child's classmates could suddenly and without warning turn into a living, breathing inferno with eyes, or begin to emit poisonous gas. Well, the point stands. Quirk manifestation had the potential to be a disastrous event. It took several more minutes and several buckets of tears, but eventually the crying duo had separated from each other. Or rather, Inko had separated herself from Izuku. Toshinori was quite certain Izuku would have been more than happy to separate earlier, but it's not like he had the capability of breaking off the hug on his own. The boy hadn't really moved for a while. We're going to talk more about this tomorrow, young man, she sniffled, wiping her soaked face with an arm sleeve. I won't bother you anymore tonight, but don't think this conversation is over. For his part, Izuku merely hung his head and, did nothing. It appeared the young man had fallen asleep within his mother's grasp. Inko turned to the terrified skeleton man who had been forced to watch the spectacle without moving, his blue eyes further receding into the sunken pits they resided inside. Standing up, the woman gingerly lifted her son and started to walk off towards a door that had an All Might-themed nameplate on it with a single word. Izuku, I'll be right back, Mr. Yagi. I just need to help Izuku get ready for bed, if that's okay, she questioned, but for whatever reason he wasn't entirely sure. It's not like she would have accepted any excuses that the man could come up with, so he instead mutely nodded his head in understanding. satisfied. Inko entered the room and Toshinori was briefly able to make out an All Might poster hanging above a simple bed in the middle of the room. That did bring a smile to his face. It was always nice to meet his fans, especially when they were unaware of Toshinori's true identity. It was nice to hear the more soft-spoken praises people sang about him, as opposed to people loudly gushing and proclaiming undying admiration while trying to snap selfies. Idly, the disguised pro-hero began to glance around the room, observing all the photos, artwork, and other decorations around the place. It was a plain room. Beige was the dominant color, with some very dark, dull greens and whites thrown into the mixture in the form of furniture and rugs. Eyeing a photograph that rested on the coffee table next to the couch Izuku was formerly imprisoned on, Toshinori noticed something peculiar. The photograph had been cut at some point. It was Izuku and his mother in what appeared to be a park or nature preserve, perhaps a hiking trail even, and was taken back before the boy had his accident as he was standing of his own volition. Inko stood immediately behind Izuku, one of her arms draped lovingly over his shoulder, a golden ring visible on her finger. Izuku, meanwhile, was glancing at a figure that was standing off to the right side of the mother, smiling brightly. The only reason Toshinori noticed the photograph had been cut at all was the fact that the mother had part of her right shoulder missing from where the cut had been made, and the presence of a disembodied arm draped over the woman's shoulder, the one who it was connected to having been removed from the photograph thanks to the edit. Toshinori didn't need to be a genius to figure out what happened there. Still, that explained why no father had come out to beat Toshinori for delaying their son from getting home. Did he say beat? He meant greet. Yeah, greet him. Shaking his head, the hero's gaze traveled downwards towards the tattered yellow remains of Midoriya's backpack, and he idly spotted a burned book that had halfway fallen out of the bag. Quickly looking at the young man's door to assure himself that the mother wouldn't be exiting at that moment in time, Toshinori quickly got up from the wheelchair, bent down to retrieve the book, and rapidly sat himself back into place. His eyes shot right back up to the door, pleased that the boy's mother hadn't appeared at that moment in time either. He dreaded to imagine the dressing down he'd receive if he left the wheelchair before he was allowed to. Shaking his head once more, Toshinori directed his attention to the remains of the book in front of him. While damaged, it looked like it had been lightly burned, and a few pieces of the cover and some shreds of paper were missing. It was still identifiable as a fairly cheap composition notebook one would likely buy in bulk. The cover simply read, Hero Analysis and Support Item Appraisal for the Future Number 17. While Toshinori cocked an eyebrow at the title, he nonetheless peeled the cover away from the first page, and was greeted by a fairly decent-looking drawing of himself. Did the Midoriya boy truly create this? How was he able to draw with such skill despite the lack of usable hands? Not to mention, the penmanship the boy demonstrated as well in his writing was. While All Might wasn't exactly the best judge of how neat handwriting was, but he would certainly admit it to be aesthetically pleasing. His stare shifted around the room, scanning for something to fill in the blanks. He was missing another piece of the Midoriya puzzle yet again. Curiously, Toshinori noticed that there were several inkwells around the room, one on the coffee table next to the couch, several of them resting on entryway table. And if he had to hazard a guess, there may be a few more inside some of the drawers inside the tables. Taking another gander at the neat writing, and then the inkwells, All Might couldn't help but wonder. Did he really extend his nervous system outside his body, dip it in ink, and then use it as a pen? The very thought sounded so barbaric, disgusting even, but how else would he be able to write at all? Shaking his head, the skeleton brought his attention back down to the notebook entry on himself, and actually decided to read a bit of whatever was written, and then he read it again, and again, and again. Toshinori slammed the notebook shut, as though the very act of doing so would magically dispel the information written down in the book. Suddenly tensing up, the man rapidly directed his attention towards the boy's bedroom door, entirely expecting a villain of some sort to burst out and attack, revealing all of this as an elaborate setup to lower his guard. After about a solid 5 minutes of staring, Toshinori finally worked up the nerve to open the book back up. Unfortunately for him, it was all still there. The quite frankly disturbingly accurate descriptions of his quirk, right down to the words power stockpiling that had been underlined and circled next to a section labeled potential quirks, along with a list of plenty of other plausible and sensible quirk options like strength enhancement or muscle augmentation. But everything had been crossed out. There were like a total of 20 different options that had been written down, and everything had been eliminated beyond power stockpiling. As if that wasn't frightening enough, the next 2 pages after were brief but accurate descriptions of battles that he'd partaken in during the past, accurately recording his movements and making startlingly accurate predictions about the amount of power he had utilized during the engagements. Not to mention the name of and exact combinations of fibers and materials that went into designing his hero costume, something that only the brilliant David Shield himself had been able to create after who knows how many months spent on research. The final 2 pages were labeled potential support items Every single piece of equipment that was listed was some sort of armor, and all of it covered at the very least his wound. The man's eyes reread the little text blurb that preceded the support items section for what seemed to be the 5th time in the past few minutes. All Might's fighting style revolves entirely around brute force and overwhelming strength to fight his opponents, and as such, the villains he has traditionally had trouble with in the past have been those who do not have combat-oriented quirks, but rather those who possess quirks that allow them to avoid or entirely skip combat. Nevertheless, All Might has always faced his opponents head-on, with his chest bared directly at any foe he faces. Within the past 5 or so years, however, his tactics have subtly shifted. Recently, All Might has been pointing the left side of his body away from those he fights, instead choosing to place the right side of himself towards the enemy instead, and appears to be more guarded than he used to be in relation to prior fights. Even when talking with reporters, he no longer stands and directly faces the camera immediately. He seems to default to a stance that turns the left side of his body away from any attention. Additionally, All Might can occasionally be seen gripping the left side of his stomach after longer drawn-out fights, and seems to instinctively cover the area with his arm whenever possible. In any case, the obvious explanation is that All Might suffered a physical injury of some sort in a fight about 5 years ago. Either way, the injury appears to have healed itself, though All Might may continue to have potential physical and mental scars from the event, resulting in his subconscious decision to protect the side where said injury occurred. The clear solution for this problem is to acquire some form of armor to cover the area where the wound once was, should there be any physical weak points remaining behind. The armor can serve as additional protection, and if it has entirely healed at this point, perhaps the armor can be utilized as a sort of comfort blanket. The simple feeling of extra protection may be enough to allow All Might to overcome any remaining trauma surrounding the incident. Toshinori's breath hitched in his chest as he rapidly flipped through the book, filled entirely to the brim with page upon page of exceptionally detailed notes on heroes of all calibers, both foreign and local. It didn't seem to matter. The notebook entry on present Mike was filled with more information on the hero than All Might himself knew about the pro, like the fact that he apparently had a twin sister with the same quirk as himself, but that she had lost it due to an unknown accident in middle school. That didn't stop this Midoriya boy from spending 2 entire pages speculating as to the nature of the wounds she suffered, and the potential methods that could be used to repair or replace her lost quirk, not to mention the numerous support items designed for present Mike himself, largely concerned with reducing the amount of collateral damage he caused from utilizing his quirk, while not compromising its power. The man's hands shot to his pocket, desperately searching around for his cell phone. He needed to call someone, but who, and what information did he need to divulge? This child somehow accurately guessed his quirk, what his costume was made of, and knew he was wounded 5 years ago. All Might kept that fight buried for a reason. He needed to. I see you found one of Izuku's little books. Toshinori startled, jolting backwards in the wheelchair he had sat himself inside, his frightened, wide-eyed stare meeting the concerned one of the boy's mother. Is everything okay, Mr. Yagi? He didn't have any naughty pictures inside his notebook, did he? All that Toshinori could do was stammer a bit, his eyes unable to decide if they wanted to read more of the book or observe the Midoriya matriarch. Did your son truly write these notes? He eventually managed to ask, after a few more moments of awkward silence. Why yes. Is something wrong with them? I know he can write a lot, but is something wrong with what he wrote? Toshinori couldn't see any trace of deception in the woman's face, only genuine confusion mixed with a bit of worry. He doesn't really do much else, unfortunately. It's not like he can. He studies a lot and writes. That's about it, really. All Might stared down at the burnt notebook in his hands like it was the original copy of the Bible itself, something sacred that needed to be treated with the utmost of care. Ma'am, the information contained in this notebook is exceptionally detailed, he replied, biting back the urge to say upsettingly accurate, not to mention some of these devices that he's laid out plans for. The rest of his sentence was lost in his throat as he dived through the notebook once more, reading across each and every line of text he came across, and staring at all the various schematics that had been laid out before his eyes. You like it? You think that Izuku made something good? Startled blue eyes traced over the woman's figure, and seeing no trace of deception, he wordlessly nodded. She smiled and rapidly covered her blushing face with her hands, as if this was the first time anyone acknowledged anything positive at all about the boy. I'm so excited. Izuku will be so pleased that someone likes his writings. Maybe he can go to UA. She gushed, quite literally jumping up and down with joy, due to the sheer number of times tonight that All Might had felt his mouth run dry. He was certain that he was going to need to drink several gallons of water by the time he arrived home tonight. Your son wants to go to UA? He questioned, his curiosity now piqued. Wordlessly, the mother nodded with a happy smile on her face as a few tears trailed down her cheeks. Izuku always wanted to be a great hero, just like All Might. Toshinori gulped. After his accident, though, he went through a really rough patch. We had a few really dark years before he reapplied himself. He told me he wasn't going to let his disability get the best of him anymore. The mother's formerly kind, worried visage was steamrolled over by the determined, confident look now etched across her face. The kind of look that told anyone who saw it to get out of the way, because nothing was going to stop her. Oh, one moment, let me show you Izuku's dream. A smile found its way back onto the face of Toshinori. The large, reassuring smile he wore when he was All Might. These designs and observations. This kid had absolutely amazing analytical prowess. His grin only grew wider as the mother re-entered Izuku's room, leaving no doubt in Toshinori's mind as to what he was about to see. Izuku's magnum opus. What he was about to see would be the result of a child who had lost everything, and then rediscovered his passion. This would undoubtedly be what the boy would utilize to proclaim to the world, "I am here." A very determined-looking mother stepped out of the room a moment later, a small binder in her hands. It was filled to the brim with a bunch of papers, that much he could see, and the cover of the binder itself had a very crudely drawn image of a green-haired child in a wheelchair, suspended in the air by what he assumed to be 4 large, mechanical arms. This was the very first thing Izuku drew when he snapped out of his funk, and he's never stopped working on his dream since then. The mother fiercely proclaimed, all but thrusting the binder into the eager arms of the wheelchair-bound skeleton, who readily accepted the offering, if it was possible. The already wide smile on Toshinori's face grew even larger as he examined the contents, which were far more intricate and detailed than the rudimentary cover art would imply. Toshinori could hear Inko talking in the background, and he did listen in, but he was unable to tear his gaze from the numerous pages in the binder, all of them relating to some aspect of his wonderful invention. A set of 4 mechanical, octopus-like limbs connected to a robotic spine he wanted to have surgically grafted onto his actual spine, through which he could properly and finally utilize his quirk to its fullest potential. Izuku had absolutely no idea how to plug the nerves in his body back into his muscles, and as such his quirk was rendered largely useless. However, it was abundantly clear that Izuku was a technological genius, and while All Might would readily admit to not understanding a large portion of what was written down, he did get the gist of it. Midoriya couldn't plug his nerves back into his muscles, so he was going to build a machine that plugged itself into his nervous system. Plenty of the other pages seemed to be speculation on what controlling the device would feel like, but ultimately, it was something that would need to be physically tested to prove anything. Seeing the excited look on the skeleton of a man in front of her who seemed to be practically shaking with energy, Inko just couldn't help herself anymore as she continued on, thoroughly encouraged. UA has top-quality materials, and an amazing track record for not just its hero course graduates, but also its support course graduates. The Midoriya woman stated matter-of-factly, further fanning the fire that was beginning to flare within Toshinori as he continued scanning the details of the boy's future limbs. It's Izuku's plan to apply for the support course, sending in one of his tech notebooks as proof of his skills. From there, he'd build that invention of his, and use it to crush the competition during the UA Sports Festival. Toshinori rapidly rose from his wheelchair, furious determination burning within his electric blue eyes that matched the fiery mother's in intensity. While this woman was clearly egging herself on, the speech was having the same effect on All Might himself. The skeleton's fists clenched. He felt that ever-familiar surge of power rise up through his system, and his body began to increase in size. He's going to stomp the competition into the ground with his new legs, and take first place without even breaking a sweat, she shouted, blissfully unaware of the situation she was about to find herself in. The pure elation of finally having someone else who believed in her son had lit a fire within the tired mother. He's going to let the world know that it can't keep him down, no matter what it throws at him. He'll stand on the winner's podium of his own power and finally announce to the entire world that, "I am here." Startled, Inko jumped backwards while her arms flopped to her side as she crashed into the couch, which was luckily positioned behind her. The woman's jaw dropped and she could do nothing more than gaze in awe upon the massive figure that currently resided in their living room, his giant muscular physique straining the fabric of his white t-shirt and cargo pants. The mountain of a man that was All Might laughed heartily, striking a heroic pose and pointing at the dumbstruck woman. "Mrs. Midoriya, I am sorry to say that your son's plans are about to change." The hulking figure boomed, the fire within him having long since transformed into a raging inferno. "Waiting for the sports festival to occur for your son's brilliance to shine is an unacceptable delay." Inko couldn't believe what was happening right now. It was all so surreal. The sheer elation she felt when someone said they liked Izuku's little sketches felt like lightning in her veins. And at that moment in time she didn't care about the qualifications that the emaciated man sitting in her living room may have held in regard to appraising support items. words. For the first time in far too many years, she was finally able to scream it out loud. That her son wasn't useless, that he wasn't helpless, that he could still make a difference in the world. And now, somehow that skinny matchstick man who was vomiting blood in the parking lot not 30 minutes ago had transformed into the symbol of peace, and was loudly proclaiming that he was going to somehow speed things up for her precious baby boy. It was too much. The poor woman's eyes rolled into the back of her head as her body went limp, unable to handle everything that she had gone through that evening. Mom. WWWYD does I it sound like a All Might I is in our living room. Inko's fainted figure didn't respond, still remaining limp on the couch sans the rise and fall of her chest with each breath she took. All Might continued to laugh as the boy's calls became slightly more frantic, while his mother remained peacefully oblivious to his distress. This Midoriya family. All Might could tell he was about to be in for one hell of a wild ride. He made a mental note to search around for the phone he seemed to be missing. Perhaps he left it in the car. It didn't matter. He'd call Power Loader up in the morning to let him know that he'd be swinging by UA in the evening with his second protege. Yes, that worked well for the pro hero, his second protege. Izuku wouldn't be able to handle the power of one for all, but that didn't mean that All Might had to ignore the boy either. Perhaps his genius mind could finally invent a pair of underwear for Mirio that didn't fall off when he used his quirk. All Might gently repositioned the woman on the couch so she was lying down on her side, deciding he'd stick around and wait for her to wake up to explain the situation now that he'd gotten over his excited outburst earlier. He had meant every word of it though, and it was necessary to reveal his secret to the woman if he wanted to start carting Izuku off to UA so he could have access to the support labs before the entrance examination in 10 months. He doubted she'd be willing to just let him disappear with her son nearly every day. In any case, this was going to be plus ultra. Inko Midoriya and her son sat stiffly at attention in their living room, eyes wide and hands positioned firmly on their knees. Izuku's because they were placed there by his mother, and Inko because she felt if she wasn't actively attempting to turn her kneecaps into bone powder, her legs might mutiny and run away from the situation she found herself in. Inko loved her son dearly and with all her heart, truly. If she didn't, she certainly wouldn't have been able to care for Izuku as well as she had throughout all these years. Unlike her former husband, feeding the boy, brushing his teeth, clothing him, changing him, Izuku was still exceptionally upset that he couldn't even control when he went to the bathroom anymore, almost more than he was at being unable to walk again. That loss of independence, especially for someone so young, it damaged him. Hisashi was supportive of the family at first, when everyone still held out hope that his previously overlooked quirk may have provided a solution towards his paralysis. But when it was revealed he was incapable of repairing the damage and it was finally accepted that Izuku would require around-the-clock care for the rest of his life, well, his temporary foreign business trip became more of a permanent move. The boy wouldn't be able to make anything of himself, and Inko was resistant to having another child since her current one needed so much support. It still disgusted her that the man she loved talked about their son as if he was a failed project, something that could be redone. We can always try again, Inko. This one may not have worked out, but our next child will, right? The divorce settlement she received was sufficient to cover Izuku's immediate medical expenses, and all the equipment she needed to acquire to care for him. Still, as much as she adored her child, she really wished he would stop giving her panic attacks like this, having him driven home by a police officer every few months with new bruises because he was an honest-to-goodness maniac behind the wheel of his chair, tantamount to a drunk driver really, did not help the poor woman's heart. And now, somehow, he had attracted the attention of the symbol of peace, who was calmly sipping tea that Inko had habitually made to calm her frayed nerves. Honestly, the massive figure of All Might sitting in a wheelchair 2 sizes too small for him and holding a tiny little floral cup was almost comical. Yet at the same time, freaking All Might was sitting in their living room, nearly crushing a wheelchair he really didn't fit in, and was daintily drinking from a cup of tea with little flowers on it. The smiles plastered on her and her son's faces were so forced it probably looked creepy. Young Midoriya. Izuku squeaked at the sudden outburst, and if he could, his body probably would have jumped up in the air and embedded himself in the ceiling. As it was, his eyes simply widened as he tried his best to remain calm. Why yes, of All Might, he stuttered out, failing miserably in his task. Tell me, young man, the symbol of peace began, holding up the charred remains of Izuku's analysis notebook, tapping the cover. Has your mother ever read this book? Has she read about me? It took all of a second for Izuku to piece it together. All Might had read his notebook, more specifically the entry about himself. The only reason All Might would ever care about something like that enough to confront him and his mother over it would be if Izuku had figured out something he didn't want known. 2 guesses as to what he figured out, and the second guess doesn't count. He noticed his mother's wide eyes dart down towards him, clearly thinking something similar. He knew that she knew her son had fucked up, that he had knowledge of something he shouldn't have. And not exactly. he began, looking away from the two adults he was unable to escape from. He had to think carefully on how to word this. Izuku looked up to the symbol of peace like everyone else did. But a secret this big? He'd be lying if he said he wasn't afraid this was about to turn into "I'm sorry, but I have to kill you for having this knowledge" situation. Why couldn't he be born dumb? But we both know about your other form. Plus, you kinda vomited blood all over the parking lot, he whispered out, noticing the hero in the room sag down into the wheelchair, smile slipping much like his posture. I think she gets the gist of it. All Might sighed and finally allowed his form to deflate. He was starting to struggle to hold on to it in any case. He'd spent his time limit earlier in the day chasing a sludge villain through the sewer system, and it was only thanks to the fiery speech of the mother that he had managed to re-inflate himself for a short period of time. Much like a burst of adrenaline, steam filled up the room and blinded the three occupants, before the air conditioning system succeeded in blowing away the obscuring fog. Inko released the death grip she had on her knees, only to transfer it over to her son, now squished tightly against her body. It was times like these the mother was glad for his immunity to pain, because even the woman recognized she was probably crushing his ribs right now. I suppose you have a point there, my boy. Looking down at the notebook once more, the hero flipped it open and scanned through its contents again. It was like looking at a train wreck. He was physically unable to stop himself from reading it over and over. He raised a skeletal hand in the air as he heard the boy take a deep breath, clearly in preparation for some long-winded apology or an attempt to swear his family to secrecy. I am not upset, young Midoriya. You should understand that first and foremost. Mother and son visibly sagged in relief, Inko finally releasing the vice-like grip she had on her son in exchange for a tight hug. I will not lie and say I was not scared or surprised when I read the contents of this notebook, he continued, flipping through a few more pages, but now I find myself intrigued, fascinated even. Izuku cocked an eyebrow at that, as his mother continued to squeeze the life out of him. Not that he could really feel it though. Tell me, have you ever built any of these contraptions you've designed? Toshinori leaned forward, only to shrink back into the wheelchair at the death glare shot towards him by the boy's mother. His eyes darted to Izuku for support, who stared directly at the symbol of peace with a deadpan expression. Seriously? All Might coughed and looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. He really wasn't on his A game today. Perhaps a better question would be, have you had anyone else build these for you? Anything at all? He pressed, forcing himself to look back towards the mother and son. Inko's expression had softened considerably, though she still looked a little miffed with the deflated pro-hero, while Izuku looked away sadly. And no, I don't have any friends or anyone who could do that, not to mention costs and materials, plus the tools one may need to build that stuff. But can they be built? Izuku's eyes stared back at the symbol of peace, who had placed the notebook to the side and was now thumbing through his binder that contained all the information on the device he was going to use to cure himself. Well, cure his immobility at least. Unbidden, his wide, frightened eyes shot towards his mother, the only person that could have possibly provided All Might with the schematics. He kept those hidden for a reason. Granted, his idea of hidden was just sliding several papers over the binder on his desk, but that was the best he could do if he wanted to keep it accessible enough that he didn't have to ask his mother to fetch it for him whenever he had a new idea pop into his head, which was quite often if he was being honest with himself. Noticing his frightened gaze, Toshinori allowed himself a small smile as he anticipated the boy's next reaction. Young Midoriya, these octo arms of yours are quite frankly brilliant. Mother and son turned their curious stares back towards the pro, a flicker of hope passing through both of their eyes. I won't pretend to understand half of what you've written down here, but I presume this to be far more than random scribbles on paper. These schematics appear quite detailed. Can this device surely be built? Inko pushed her son gently away from her body, keeping her hands on his shoulders to steady the boy. Nodding down towards her son, as if giving him permission to speak, Izuku sighed. I don't know, he admitted, tears leaking down from the corner of his eyes. I've only had myself to check my own work, and while I think the math is all there, I just won't know until someone else can give me feedback. Oh, Izuku, Inko mumbled, pulling her son into a far gentler hug, stroking a hand through his messy green hair. I'm sorry I can't be smart like you. All Might could see the boy's eyes widen, and his mouth was about to open up, clearly to shout out something in support of his mother. All Might decided, borrowing an expression from America, that it was time to add in his own 2 cents before the pair engaged in another cry fest. That's where I come in. Bright green eyes transferred back towards sunken blue orbs, as All Might smiled. I'd like to take you and your son with me to UA tomorrow, and have my friend Powerloader take a look at a few of these schematics. I'll even persuade him to build these arms for you if it's possible, young man. Though, we'll need to have a very long talk about this surgery you say you'll need. His piece finished, Toshinori had less than a second to breathe before Izuku's watery eyes transformed into bright, glowing orbs and the smile on his face came back with a luminosity to rival the sun itself. I am going to meet P. Powerloader. He's like the most well-known support gadget designer and pro hero ever. Well, obviously there are more well-known support gadget designers out there, and better-known heroes, but none of them are both heroes and gadget designers like Powerloader is. Is it true that he designed his own super suit, the one that looks like a giant construction vehicle? Does his tunneling quirk actually make big enough tunnels for his entire suit to fit underground with it? Or does his suit have some sort of augmenting function that allows him to create tunnels of sufficient size? Oh, his helmet. Does he always wear it for a reason? I've seen him without it on before. But even when he's out in public as a civilian, he seems to like to wear it. Is there a particular reason for that? Does he maybe? Surgery. Izuku's ranting. Fanboying was quickly silenced as he cowered in fear from his mother, once again crushing the life out of her child. Mom. Adair. While Izuku couldn't feel the potentially bone-shattering hug, he could feel his inability to breathe. It was one of the few things in his body he still had partial control over. Had his spinal cord been severed any higher than it currently was, he'd have lost his ability to do even that and would have needed a ventilator just to survive. Why would you need surgery? She continued to wail, smashing Izuku's face against her chest and screaming into his hair as the boy's arms limply jerked about with the mother's movements. Taking pity on the child, Toshinori attempted to calm her delicate sensibilities. And Mrs. Midoriya, I'll be having Recovery Girl examine these pages as well, acting as sort of an advisor to Powerloader. I understand that surgery is a major thing, especially since I don't think anything like this has ever been attempted before. But I assure you that if there are any alternatives, Powerloader and Recovery Girl shall be more than willing to speak up. I'd consider the plan written down here as more of a last resort. Clearly forcing herself, Enko allowed her child to have a little breathing room and separated from him once again. But both men knew this was likely far from the last time Izuku would be used as surrogate stuffed animal tonight. Toshinori's words appeared to have calmed the mother down a little bit, but Izuku frowned. His design hinged entirely around getting a robotic spine to attach the arms onto, with the spine serving as housing for his extended nervous system, electricity generation, and a computer processing unit for all the programming that they would require. While he'd admit under duress it wasn't strictly necessary to have it surgically grafted onto his back, he wanted it to be. In all the dreams Izuku has had over the years, all the fantasies he'd concocted where his octo arms were a reality, he'd never imagined a scenario where they were taken off. This lack of independence he found himself stuck with. He hated it, loathed it with every fiber of his being. He'd prefer being quirkless over being paralyzed like this. It wouldn't have even been that bad if he still had the use of his arms, but being totally dependent on others hurt Izuku immensely. His mother was tired, he knew it. She loved him, of that there was no doubt, but Izuku understood that he was dragging her down in a literal sense. Izuku had forced himself to be more realistic after his accident occurred. He couldn't even bring himself to hate his father, who abandoned the family when he realized that the kid was going to be literal baggage for the rest of their lives, and then, if by some miracle Izuku outlived them, he'd be some underpaid worker's problem in an assisted living facility where he would rot for a few more years before finally dying alone. The sheer number of times Izuku had thought of just ending his life was alarming. At least, that's what his therapist had said. He'd been placed under incredibly strict watch for the first few years after his accident since, unlike most quadriplegics, Izuku had the capability of killing himself. He'd just need to spear his nervous system through a few vital organs, maybe even drive it through his brain like a bullet, and that'd be it. That was why he was under such heavy scrutiny, though. He was holding a knife to his throat for years, and it was literally impossible for anyone to take it away. The sole reason he never went through with it was because he knew his mother would be devastated. Even though in his opinion at the time she should really be glad. Experimental quirk suppressant drugs and cuffs, intensive therapy sessions, and constant vital sign monitoring filled up 2 years' worth of his memories. He'd readily admit being glad to have gone through the experience, however, because he did eventually find the will to live again. His therapist still called to check in occasionally, and that was nice, even if it did remind him they were the closest things besides his mother that he could call friends. No one wanted to hang out with the quadriplegic after all. It's not like they could do anything besides talk and make everyone else uncomfortable. But that's why he wanted that spine grafted onto his. If anyone wanted to take it off, they'd have to kill him first. Izuku liked to think he understood himself fairly well, and he knew that if he ever got his mobility back, he'd rather die than lose it all again. He often pondered if he'd ever kill someone else to prevent his loss of independence, but he hadn't quite come to an answer on that one yet. It was one of the few things Izuku was comfortable allowing itself to remain an unknown, even when his desire to understand demanded he solve every problem or question that whizzed through his head, be it technical or philosophical. I understand that this is quite a lot of information to take in at once, but please, give us a chance, Toshinori pleaded, directing his attention squarely towards the Midoriya matriarch, as ultimately it was her decision whether or not this could take place. She seemed to ponder it for a moment, frequently opening her mouth to speak and then closing it, obviously reconsidering. Toshinori swallowed audibly. He did not just reveal his greatest secret to this small little family for her to say no. If I agree. Izuku and Toshinori visibly perked up, their excitement growing. What's going to happen to my baby boy? All Might smiled and leaned forward in his chair, gesturing to the youngest Midoriya as he spoke. Well, as I mentioned before, I'll be running some of your son's designs by Powerloader at UA. He's the head of the support department, Toshinori said, not missing the way her eyes twinkled at the mention of the support course. If even a small number of these devices are actually in the realm of possibility, I can already promise you a full recommendation to the support course. He's been pretty desperate to sink his metal fingertips into promising students. The mother looked confused at that statement, tilting her head curiously. Why's that? Surprisingly, it was Izuku who chipped in, stealing the words about to come from his mother's mouth. All Might allowed his smile to transform into something more closely resembling a smirk, as his brow narrowed. Quite frankly, young man, Powerloader's been hard-pressed to find a support course student who could win in the sports festival. I'm certain you've watched plenty of our previous events, so you should know that it's exceedingly rare for any students beyond those in the hero courses to make it to the third and final round. If my memory serves me correctly, the last time a student that wasn't from the hero course made it to the final round was 2, maybe 3 years ago. He's constantly losing money by betting on the support course students in the festival, isn't he? Inko turned to glare down at her son while Toshinori spit up a few more flecks of blood, thankfully catching it in his mouth this time. That's and not inaccurate, he managed to stutter out, averting his eyes from the room's 2 other occupants. Inko only sighed at the admission while Izuku managed to look fairly smug, clearly pleased with himself. Toshinori shook his head and refocused himself. He still needed to get his mother's permission, regardless of my colleague's poor financial decisions. The fact of the matter is that Powerloader will be more than happy to build these arms for you if they can be created. I'm even willing to foot the bill. Mother and son looked ready to protest at that notion, but Toshinori held up another hand and allowed his smirk to return. It's okay, he'll pay me back when your son crushes the competition. It was Inko's turn to blush bright red, looking away from Toshinori as she mumbled something under her breath. Izuku, who hadn't heard the earlier conversation, was staring at his mother in obvious confusion. I do understand that this has been quite the night for the pair of you, so I'd simply ask that you think on it if you cannot decide tonight. I presume you know where UA is? He asked, knowing full well the answer. Who didn't know where UA was? The giant H-shaped complex was a veritable landmark for the city, not to mention the several faux cities and towns built behind it for testing purposes. At the mother's nod, he continued, if you're interested in my proposal, why don't you drive your son down to the campus at around 4:30 in the afternoon? Most of the students will have left the campus by then, but the staff tend to stick around for much longer. I could guide you in, give a small tour, and we could go to the support department afterwards. Toshinori hoped that the additional time frame for acceptance would placate the mother, and his bet seemed to pay off. She visibly relaxed and sighed, nodding slightly. I think that would be for the best, she said with a yawn, glancing off to the wall-mounted clock hanging above their small TV. Nearly midnight. Toshinori stood up from his wheelchair, doing his best to ignore the small glare sent at him by the boy's mother, and gave a small bow to the pair. Please, do consider my offer. You have my number saved in your phone's history, so should you need anything, feel free to call. Perhaps it is for the best if we all wait until tomorrow to consider this proposal. Inko had leaned Izuku back into the couch and pushed his body down into the seat cushions a bit so his body wouldn't just topple over, before standing up and mimicking the skeleton's gesture. I agree. All Might. His eyes rolled at that, but it was to be expected. Who would think the symbol of peace looked less healthy than the kid who couldn't move anything besides his own head? Toshinori nodded and silently excused himself from their abode, thankful the persuasive mother didn't attempt to wheel him out of the apartment in the chair. His pride had taken enough hits today. Walking back to his truck, nodding at the sight of his phone left alone on the dashboard, All Might knew he'd see the family again tomorrow. They just needed a little bit of time to process all of the information, and quite frankly, so did Toshinori. He'd not felt dread in quite some time, but reading that book, knowing that someone out there was able to discern his weakness, it frightened him. His gaze traveled downwards towards the burnt notebook he had liberated from the apartment, and Izuku's octo arm binder. He was sure of one thing, even though he wasn't certain that the arms themselves could be built. That kid would be a hero, in some way or another. He wasn't going to let something as small as paralysis get in his way. I know you said a young man wrote this. But come on, All Might, that's him? Powerloader asked incredulously, staring at one of the many glowing monitors that comprised UAS security room, observing the television broadcasting the feed from UAS front gate where a tall, slender woman in shades and a sun hat was pushing a small figure in a wheelchair forward. The massive walls that normally shielded UA to the outside world had come down, and the blocky form of Cementos smiled as he greeted the two visitors, clearly embarrassed by the obsessive fanboying coming from the wheelchair-bound child. Toshinori simply smirked as he witnessed Cementos shakily sign a notebook handed to him by the similarly grinning mother, knowing exactly what was occurring down there. Izuku managed to get another signature for his collection. Come to think of it, he'd probably want All Might's signature soon, too. He knew the boy would be pleased when he got his notebook back, though. There was a page at the very end that had yet to be filled with notes, and in true All Might fashion, he signed the entire page. He could practically hear the child's squeal of delight. Maybe that was coming from the security feed, though. It didn't matter. All Might maintained quite the smug form, lounging back in a nearby office chair in his skeletal form as he watched the still-shaken Cementos give a tour to the excitable child and mother, walking them across UAS illustrious school grounds. Everyone he'd be dealing with today already knew his secret, so there was no reason to waste any more of his muscle form's time limit for today. The reason for his smugness was that off to the right of him, Powerloader and Recovery Girl were busying themselves frantically flipping through page upon page of Izuku's notebook and binder, taking in the sights of the boy's genius like a sponge soaking up water. Powerloader was mostly preoccupied with the burnt notebook, rapidly scribbling down notes and making rough recreations of Izuku's designs in a small pocketbook the man kept on his person for situations like this, where an idea popped into his head and he needed to put pen to paper before the inspiration disappeared. Judging by the few remaining pages in his own personal notebook that Powerloader was working with, he'd be kept pretty busy for quite some time. Recovery Girl was similarly writing down information in her personal notepad, though in a far more reserved manner than the manic Powerloader. She seemed to carefully read each and every page she came across, occasionally nudging Powerloader to get his opinion on some of the mechanics and math Izuku had jotted down and would be rewarded without fail by a strange gurgling noise that sounded almost like a squeak, and a rapid nod. Following that, the elderly woman could only sigh and scribble down her own notes, doing her best to recreate Izuku's diagrams and charts. All Might had acted much the same last night, and as a testament to that was currently running solely off of coffee in the absence of a good night's sleep. But seeing his distressed colleagues did bring the man a small amount of sadistic glee. Now they knew how it felt. Powerloader cursed as he finally ran out of space to work with in his notepad, filled to the brim with hastily made copies and notes on Izuku's designs, his eyes darting around the room in an attempt to find more writing materials. All Might began, trying and failing to keep the smugness out of his voice. I never expected plagiarism from the likes of you, Higari. Powerloader glared at the scrawny form of All Might from under the brim of his dinosaur-like mask, while Recovery Girl simply sighed and continued reading. It was difficult dealing with the over-the-top All Might at his base form. Adding smugness into the mixture did not sit well with the elderly heroine. She could already feel the migraine caused the walking medical anomaly of All Might himself growing in strength. Chiyo did her best to tune out Powerloader's verbal tirade against the symbol of peace and flipped through several more pages of the binder to examine the diagrams this Midoriya child had apparently designed himself. Specifically, she was looking through his proposed surgery plans. If Chiyo had been in Mustafu at the time of this boy's accident, she quite likely could have saved the boy from his current paralyzed state. It saddened the elderly woman a bit, but she had long ago stopped berating herself for being unable to help everyone in need. She was only one person after all, and she couldn't be everywhere at once. Her frighteningly powerful healing capabilities made her quite extensively sought after by heroes and private citizens alike. Midoriya seemed rather obsessed with these arms of his sons as he referred to them within the notes, and it was readily apparent that he had absolutely no intention of ever removing this device. His arms would plug into an insert point he wanted installed into the back of his neck, which amounted to a small metallic circle that would be implanted within his vertebra. This small button was to serve as essentially a female jack for his robotic spine's male connector, allowing his nervous system a path to grow into a small housing unit kept within the faux spine to be connected with his arms. The connection between arms and nervous system was a rather ingenious invention of Midoriya's own design, a specially crafted type of fiber optic cable created with tissue derived from the boy's own nerve cells, woven into a synthetic housing that mimicked real flesh. In layman's terms, the boy wanted to harvest his own nervous system and turn them into wires. Higari's squeak of approval at the math Chiyo had shown him merely caused the heroine to sigh in defeat. She didn't want to do this. Even the boy himself recognized that this surgery was highly risky, and he might not survive the procedure. Chiyo was nothing if not thorough, however. When All Might had dropped by the school with his odd requests, 10 months before his tenure was to begin, she might add, Chiyo called in some favors with local hospitals and quickly unraveled the past of this mysterious Midoriya character Toshinori had referred to. While she wasn't legally allowed to have access to the information she gathered, being a pro-hero came with the perks of being able to bend the rules. That was how she knew his medical history, his time spent on high alert in the mental facility. Glancing back at the many monitors, she observed Cementos build small ramps and other obstacles that the child gleefully navigated his wheelchair through, much to his own mother's distress. Even so, the woman smiled. Her baby was happy, probably happier than he had been in a long time. All Might tended to raise people's spirits quite a bit when he was around, despite the fact that he was a walking hypocrite. The elderly woman sighed and rubbed that spot between her eyes where the dull throbbing continued unabated. Even as she resigned herself, she'd be performing the surgery, she already knew. If these arms of his didn't work, the boy would be crushed. It was quite clear these arms were one of the few things the boy had to keep himself going forward in life. Even though the potential consequence for building these arms was quite literally death, Chiyo felt that not building had an even higher chance of that unfortunate outcome. She knew his quirk. He could do it whenever he wanted to. Quirk suppressants of all types worked terribly on mutant-type quirk users, and this boy was a mutant, not an emitter or transformer. Shota couldn't stare at the child forever if the boy decided it wasn't worth it. With that in mind, Chiyo busied herself making the various calculations and precautions she'd be taking in the near future. Powerloader's unusual behavior all but confirmed to the heroine that his inventions were entirely within the realms of possibility, so she needed to prep for the coming surgery in a few months. Several metal inserts in his vertebra, plus quite literally bolting the artificial spine atop his old one to prevent accidental removal or other mishaps. And that was just the base design he wanted for his civilian attire. The hero costume he had preemptively designed was another story. It would need a small bit of work, but Chiyo was overall pleased with the schematics. It was almost a metal sarcophagus really, with openings for his head, arms and legs, and it quite literally served the dual function of armor and portable life support unit, hospital. The boy wasn't in immediate need of such treatment, but with his paralysis came the unfortunate side effect of not knowing when one was injured. Chiyo could quite literally break his legs while the boy was blindfolded, remove the blindfold, and he'd have absolutely no idea what occurred if there wasn't any physical damage present to alert him. His suit was designed for the express purpose of monitoring and reporting any damage at all to the boy, so he would know when he had to stop. Quite frankly, it was one of the most sensible hero costumes she had ever laid eyes on. Too many of these new, flashy heroes had costumes that showed off far too much skin, or even worse, wore skin-tight spandex that provided absolutely no protection whatsoever. It was refreshing to see a young man take his own limits into account. In addition to the portable medbay that functioned as his costume, Midoriya had planned for the front half of his costume to have an additional 4 tentacles protruding from it, bringing the total number of arms under his control to 8. His real arms would be bound in front of him to the suit itself, positioned across his chest in an X shape to prevent the limbs from flailing about and getting in the way of his robotic arms. And his legs had large, circular magnetic discs on the sides of his kneecaps and ankles that would keep the two limbs together to prevent similar mishaps. Chiyo scribbled a few additions to the costume down on her own notepad. If the boy wanted her to perform this surgery, then he'd be acquiescing to the changes she was making to his suit. Too many heroes decided they were invincible and beyond the scope of injuries normal people would sustain. Things like smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning meant nothing to far too many pros. This boy was getting an oxygen mask strapped to his face and protective eyewear, and absolutely nothing he could say would change Chiyo's mind on that. She liked his addition of the 4 extra arms. It was a nice increase in strength, but the boy would need to train himself quite thoroughly to utilize all of those limbs at once. The human brain was hardwired to move 2 hands and 2 legs, not 8 robotic tentacles. It'd take a bit of training for him to master any sort of movement with these things. Still, Chiyo would readily admit that's what UA was for, to help people understand and control their powers responsibly. There really was no better place for Midoriya to learn how to live with his new arms. Sighing, she closed the binder and slid her personal notebook back into her pocket. Cementos had begun his approach to the support department. Chiyo hopped off the chair she sat herself inside, cane clicking against the floor as she shuffled out of the room with the slouching forms of Powerloader and All Might trailing behind the woman, the three forming quite the unusual pair. Toshinori still smiled when they entered the development studio. Chiyo bore a grim yet determined expression on her face, and Higari was still drooling over both Midoriya's notebook and binder simultaneously, unable to keep his attention devoted to one over the other for very long periods of time. Midoriya himself was puttering around the room, marveling at all the technological oddities, tools, and workbenches scattered about the workshop itself, obviously fascinated by all of the unknown technology surrounding him. Wow, you guys actually have a ferromagnetic 3D printer. I thought these things were only present on my island. Chiyo stood corrected. He knew exactly what everything in the room was and was simply excited to be around all the tools he could never use. Cementos blushed and rapidly excused himself, muttering something about flirting with a brick wall while Mrs. Midoriya waved daintily at his retreating form, peering at him from above the rims of her sunglasses with a not at all innocent smirk. Chiyo allowed herself a small grin at that. Embarrassing Cementos was a difficult task on the best of days. She could already tell she'd like the shades-wearing woman. All Might meanwhile had sauntered up to Midoriya's wheelchair and rested his hand upon the boy's head, ruffling his hair much to the child's obvious delight. I see you two decided to take me up on my offer. As promised, I've brought the head of the support department, he said, gesturing to power loaders back, as the man was currently busy digging around underneath his desk for something, leaving only his skinny spine visible. Shrugging, All Might gestured over to Chiyo herself, and she responded with a polite bow. And this is Recovery Girl, the school nurse. Oi, no more ambushing people for autographs, my boy. We'll have plenty of time for that later. Higari stiffened, slowly glancing to the wheelchair-bound form of Midoriya as he pouted within his seat, much to Inko and Toshinori's amusement. Chiyo watched the man curiously, wondering what had startled him so. The only thing All Might had done was tell the boy that he couldn't demand his autograph right now. Well, he did call him my boy. Did Higari actually think that All Might was referring to Midoriya as his child? Chiyo pursed her lips and did the very best she could to hide her smirk. She had seen the boy's medical history, so she knew who his father actually was. But that didn't mean she had to tell Higari. Watching pro heroes squirm about was one of the few things about her job she found to be enjoyable, and when she could play a prank as hilarious as this on both All Might and Power Loader, while the opportunity was too good to pass up, she'd remain silent for now. If the head of the support department couldn't figure it out, that was his own fault. The Midoriya matriarch returned Chiyo's polite bow before moving to stand beside All Might and her child, hand resting on his wheelchair's armrest. The elderly woman noticed how her eyes kept darting back and forth between her son's notebooks and her, the unspoken question hanging heavily in the air. Chiyo allowed herself a deep breath before voicing her thoughts, as Higari moved to stand behind her. I suppose I'll cut right to the point, Mrs. Midoriya. We can indeed build what your son desires, but we have a few reservations. As soon as the words left the nurse's mouth, the boy's happy visage slipped immediately into a neutral expression, waiting to hear the rest of the explanation. Or perhaps, he was simply waiting to hear what he already knew. The way he seemed to look straight through Chiyo, studying her every move as if analyzing every single detail about her, waiting for a slip-up of some sort. Higari lurched forward, placing one of his large metal-tipped hands upon Chiyo's shoulder. Like my colleague has said, these arms of yours are entirely within the realm of possibility, young man. But the installation procedure that you describe is particularly dangerous, not to mention the long recovery period you'll need to get used to your augmentations. I know, was the simple response he deigned them with. Power Loader and All Might balked at the child's calm demeanor, but Chiyo merely sighed. She knew he'd respond like that, and judging by the forlorn expression upon his mother's face, so did she. Chiyo spoke up, directing the attention back upon herself. Young man, while I am willing to perform most of the operation you desire, I will have to decline your proposal to surgically attach the arms to your back. She spoke, holding up a hand to silence the eerily calm child before he could spit back a retort. The proposal to install jacks into your vertebra is something I consider a reasonable request. But you should understand that the arms we are willing to build for you will require improvements, and you'll likely think of several upgrades. He seemed puzzled for a moment, before realization dawned upon his face, and he cast his gaze downwards. These arms he wanted. They were version 1.0. All inventions require improvements, and if he had his device bolted to his spine, he'd require surgery simply to swap the device out. There's only so much software updates and swapping out parts could do for a device before its warranty expired entirely. So what do you propose? He whispered, daring to glance back up to the diminutive heroine. She allowed a smile to grace her wrinkled lips, kindly addressing the boy. The only modification to your designs I have considered is skipping the process of bolting the device to your spine. We should still install the insertion points for the device to plug into and create, say, a locking belt of some sort to keep it attached to your body. That should provide you the capability of swapping between various arm designs you can create. You've clearly tried to cram as many features as possible into your arms here, making them multi-purpose, but why not branch out and specialize? You could design specific arms for specific problems and choose to excel in situations where your performance would otherwise be mediocre. She explained, succeeding in both placating the boy and relieving the mother. A surgery to simply install a jack or two into his spine would still be risky, but considerably less so than attaching the entire device to his back. The boy nodded in acceptance, straightening his neck to face Chiyo head-on. That's acceptable. I hadn't thought of doing something like that before. Higari nodded in the boy's direction, shooting him a thumbs up. Don't worry about it, kid. Us inventors can get tunnel vision real easy when trying to tackle a hard problem. The real test is being able to accept our mistakes and reach out for help, he reassured, bringing a large smile back to the boy's face. That grin actually did remind her of All Might's moneymaker. Higari waltzed over to the kid, notebook in hand, and started pestering the blushing boy about all the designs and creations he had jotted down within his burned notebook. Shio beckoned his mother over with a hand, and All Might decided to follow as well. Leading the pair away from the two diminutive men, Chio whispered to his mother and All Might in the corner of the room. Mrs. Midoriya, are you comfortable with this procedure taking place? Are you even aware of what the procedure is? She asked in a hushed tone, doing her best not to alert the green-haired child. Despite what he clearly desired, he was underage. All decisions would have to be cleared with his mother, and she obviously didn't want to ponder her decision in front of her child. Toshinori's skeletal brow furrowed in concern as the mother cast her eyes down, deep in thought. Her shoulders sagged, and she took in a deep breath before sighing in a way only exasperated mothers were truly capable. To tell you the truth, recovery girl, I know very little of what my son plans to do to himself, or even in general. I don't know where he gets those brains of his from. It's certainly not from his parents. I can't understand anything he writes or talks about. Chio grabbed the distraught mother's hand with her own as the tears started to fall, the green-haired woman's emotions bubbling over. She was silently grateful Toshinori had warned her of the family's tendency to cry, even if it wasn't something she'd not dealt with in the past. Tears were simply a part of the healthcare business. Not every patient survived, and there were always distraught family members to console. Even so, she continued, watery yet determined eyes peering past Chio's purple-tinted visor and gazing directly into the heroine's own, I'm going to allow it. If you can promise you'll do your utmost best to keep my child safe, I'll allow it. He needs this. If this is tea taken away from him too. She trailed off, the unspoken implications clear even to Toshinori himself, judging by the way he swallowed nervously. Chio nodded and squeezed the mother's hand reassuringly, putting on a brave face herself. She would obviously try her best, but the human body was not designed to be cut open and played with. Surgery and modern medicine were quite literally against the will of nature itself, and even mundane, commonplace surgeries could experience lethal complications at any time. The pact was already made, however, the mother's permission secured. Chio began to mentally prepare herself that would be the nightmare of this child's surgery. It wouldn't happen for at least a month or two, so she had plenty of time, but this would be a delicate operation. The child only had so much nervous system left for his quirk to work with. Damaging more could decrease his already limited capabilities. The knowledge your son has is beyond extensive, and I presume you aren't sitting by his side every second scrolling through web pages or flipping through books for him, are you? Chio questioned the mother, snapping her out of her introspection. The green-haired woman hastily wiped the tears from her eyes and glanced back over to her boy and Higari, the latter of the pair waving at the woman while the former excitedly bobbed his head from side to side, in what Chio assumed to be his approximation of waving. Actually, we just got him one of those laptops with a touchscreen. He's able to use his nervous system to play around with it pretty well. He's also got this headset the hospital gave us with an eye tracker on the inside, but he doesn't like to use it. Says it's too slow. Chio understood why the mother seemed to trail off at the end. She wasn't happy with Izuku's use of his nervous system. He was cutting his own body up just to use it, even though he couldn't feel anything. Toshinori let out a low whistle. He was aware technology of that sort existed, but he hadn't thought of how the boy would use the internet, or even how he gathered all the knowledge he had accrued. For once, Chio couldn't blame the man. People never really understood the struggles people without control of their body went through. Even the simplest of tasks, like clicking the button on a mouse, were impossible. Izuku obviously had slightly more mobility with his prehensile nervous system, but typing on a physical keyboard was probably a struggle, if not an impossibility, hence his reliance on touch screens and eye tracking. Without his quirk, eye tracking equipment would be his only option. Recovery girl nodded and beckoned Higari and Midoriya over with a finger, patiently waiting for the two to arrive in their little corner of the room. She let out a suffering sigh, her gloved hand pulling against the side of her wrinkled face in tired frustration. I'm in, she affirmed, staring directly at Higari. He didn't need to voice his opinion on the matter. He was eager to build any device that piqued his interest, no matter how dangerous it could be. Despite all his bluster about safety protocols, the man had a penchant for letting students do pretty much whatever they wanted so long as no injuries occurred. There was a reason every teacher in UA called the development studio the powder keg. Something inside it was going to explode. It was really just a matter of when. The Midoriya child's eyes lit up like neon lights, flashing with barely restrained joy at Chio's declaration. His dream, it would happen. The elderly woman turned her attention towards the wheelchair-bound figure, addressing him with a modicum of respect. He would be an essential component in building his arms. Even with Recovery Girl and Powerloader's combined efforts, it was still a highly advanced piece of equipment that the child in front of them designed. Higari could build just about anything given enough time, and Chiyo's surgical skills and medical knowledge would keep the support hero grounded to reality. But that still left the programming of the device unattended. Midoriya recognized his brain wouldn't understand how to manipulate and control these arms. It simply wasn't designed to do such a thing with precision. Technically, Chiyo would be able to move them around if she received the surgery in Midoriya's stead, but there'd be no real control, just flailing. In order to perform all the delicate, sensitive tasks Midoriya wanted his arms to fulfill, he'd need more assistance. His notes spoke of a program he'd been designing and had apparently already gotten started on before he hit the roadblock of not being able to test his code in any sort of simulation or running it through the device to see if it responded correctly. Now that someone would be creating a chassis for him, he'd be able to keep working on his code. The code was relatively simple in its purpose if complex in its design. It was a translator of sorts. It'd receive and analyze the electrical signals fired off from his brain down into his nervous system, and then process, translate, and transmit said signals into understandable orders for his arms to follow. His true challenge was designing something that would be able to rapidly translate his brain waves into understandable orders, rather than his current prediction of there being several seconds of delay as the computer processed the information. I won't sugarcoat this, though I'm sure it goes without saying, Chiyo began, glaring across at the two who would be, for all intents and purposes, her partners for the foreseeable future. We are going to need to be precise and methodical, rigorously documenting and triple-checking every calculation and modification we make. Higari and Midoriya quickly wiped the grins off their faces, stoically matching the woman's own intensity. That was good. It meant the boy understood how much effort he'd still need to put in. Higari seemed to be prepared to make a concerted effort not to blow anything up for once, so that too was a relief. Young man, your mother has informed me off the tablet you use to study and browse the internet with. Higari here will be able to provide you with a touch-screen computer with far more power than the one you're currently using. And with it, it'll be up to you to formulate the necessary programming your arms will require. Higari may be able to build anything, but his knowledge of coding doesn't exceed what your mind seems capable of. Chiyo received a slightly grumpy stare from Powerloader, but otherwise he seemed to be in agreement. He wouldn't be able to program something that analyzed another person's brainwaves, and as such, Izuku would have to complete that task himself. He nodded, understanding the role he would be playing in the upcoming trials. I get it, he began, gently rocking the still form of Izuku. You couldn't work much on your code cause you could never test it, right? Hit a roadblock. The boy nodded at the man's question, eyes downcast. Higari clenched his fist in determination, pumping it up in the air with enthusiasm. Don't worry about none of that anymore, kid. I'll have a prototype up and working by the end of this week, he loudly declared, drawing a scrutinizing stare from the wheelchair-bound child. Thankfully, he continued before Midoriya could say anything else. It won't be a full set of arms, or capable of nearly anything you've written down in this book here, he said, waving around the child's binder. It'll likely just be a single arm with some pincers. Probably won't be able to lift much more than your average person will. We just need this prototype up and running so we can see if the connections your machine establishes with the device function properly. Green orbs filled with understanding, and he stared at the skinny form of Powerloader with gratitude almost overflowing from his eyes. I get it now. The prototype will be used to test out all my connections, and additionally used as a debugging tool for my code. Chiyo nodded at the explanation, tapping her cane upon the ground to draw attention back to herself. Precisely. Additionally, having just a single arm will be sufficient for you to remain immobile and let your body adjust to the modifications we make, yet still allow you to test out your invention. I don't want you twisting your spine around by walking with those metal limbs of yours while your body heals and adjusts to its new inserts, she sternly declared, fixing the boy with a harsh glare. Midoriya had the decency to look slightly ashamed. Clearly he knew that he'd be readily stomping around UAS grounds the second he got his limbs up and running. Toshinori chimed into the conversation, once again slapping a bony hand atop the boy's mop-like hair. How often will young Midoriya need to come into UA? Surely this computer you mentioned he'd be provided with couldn't be all that compact. Chiyo resisted the urge to cock an eyebrow at the unusually observant All Might. The man seemed just a hair above oblivious to the world around him on the best of days. Instead, for the first time in a long while, she found herself complimenting the man. Very observant of you, Toshi, and quite right you are. Frankly, Midoriya will need to come here often, and while I understand he still goes to school, we'll need him here as much as possible. You happen to have a copy of his schedule, Mrs. Midoriya? The elderly woman turned her questioning stare to the boy's mother, patiently awaiting her response. She didn't expect the one she received. Ah, that won't be necessary anymore. I'm withdrawing him from middle school. The harsh glare sent towards the boy immediately after the response drew shock from all parties involved, aside from Izuku himself. I'm looking into private educators right now, so he can still graduate on time, but I refuse to send Izuku back to that dreadful school. If they won't watch over my child, then I'll do it myself. She practically spat the word school out like it was a curse. And while all might seem placated, the boy would be receiving an education. Chiyo couldn't help but notice how he shrunk away from the angry woman's waving hands and refused to look her in the eye. Higari seemed confused as well, puzzling silently over the outburst, but Chiyo decided to analyze the facts at hand. Turning back to the Midoriya boy, she took a close look at him, drinking in his features. Despite the fact that it was a sari, the boy was still wearing that standard black school uniform with his collar popped up like some kind of delinquent. The collar succeeded in covering a large portion of the boy's neck, but she could still see the area around his Adam's apple and part of his collarbones between the straightened fabric. Izuku appeared to have several dark splotches of skin around his neck similar to the ones on his fingertips, which Chiyo presumed to be scars gained from utilizing his quirk to slice through his skin. Slightly disconcerting, but nothing too alarming considering the boy's situation. He'd made it this far in life, so he obviously knew enough about his biology not to cut through anything important. She could just make out the beginning of splotchy, wrinkled red skin coming around from the back of his neck, stretching down to his collarbone, but Chiyo couldn't see the full extent of the damage. She presumed it to be a burn scar of some sort. Perhaps it was the accident he suffered from that broke his neck. She frowned a bit, despite knowing that the boy's neck had been broken in what was termed an accident. There was literally no information recorded in his records beyond that. The elderly woman knew something fishy was afoot. Likely lawyers from parents or even a school had gotten involved, and the boy and his mother were made to sign some sort of non-disclosure agreement. Things like that tended to happen far too often nowadays. Children hurting others when playing around with their quirks, and then the parties involved desperately tried to cover up the accidents to prevent anything negative being attached to their child's record. Chiyo knew what happened. Some kid got a little too excited with their new quirk and lost control around Izuku. She shook her head and observed the rest of the boy, frowning further. The back of one of his hands had cuts across it where it looked like some skin had been scraped off after being dragged across the road, probably from him falling off his wheelchair at some point. And she guessed if his shirt was taken off he'd be littered with other self-inflicted scars, both from his quirk and the tantamount reckless driving of his wheelchair. Chiyo had seen the boy demonstrate through the security cameras. His face had a large bruise across it, going from his cheek up to his forehead, and she could see the ends of a butterfly bandage sticking out from underneath his messy green hair. Chiyo's cane shot over to the boy's leg, lifting up the fabric of the dark pants he wore to find a plethora of bruised skin, several bandages, and to Chiyo's surprise, warped and discolored flesh that were the unmistakable mark of burn scars. Curiously, many had a star-like shape to them, as if an explosion had gone off directly upon the flesh. She was about to raise the pants leg higher than his calves before the boy's chair retreated backwards, Izuku's nervous system tugging down on his wheelchair's toggle. Midoriya glared at nothing in particular, obviously not wanting to scowl at the woman agreeing to help him, but unable to hide his displeasure at the small invasion of privacy. Chiyo also noticed he refused to look in the direction of his mother, who was currently sending him what was best described as a death glare even All Might was slowly inching away from. "Young man, you'll be very near naked for your surgery, as I'll be needing access to your entire spine. I'll be seeing every scar you have eventually." Her lips pursed in confusion at the child before her. The scars weren't that bad. Then again, maybe he just didn't like others seeing how weak he was. Most young men tended to hate showing weakness, unless worried eyes shot towards the mother, who huffed and gave up trying to force Izuku to look at her. She turned her attention back to Chiyo and gestured to her son with a hand. "That's why I'm taking him out of school. They don't care what the other children do to him. The teachers simply ignore it all." She scowled. "It's not that bad, Mom." Izuku made the mistake of speaking, daring to look back at his mother. The withering glare shot back towards her son silenced him instantly. "They dragged you up 2 flights of stairs and left you on the roof. Plus, since your phone was destroyed, you couldn't call for help. Then, because who else would think of something so utterly stupid, you decided the best course of action was to fling your wheelchair down the stairwell." The woman shouted, grabbing her child by the shoulders and shaking him around. Toshinori surprisingly intervened, tugging back on the child's wheelchair and placing his hands protectively upon the boy's shoulders once he was out of the mother's grasp. Perhaps even more surprisingly, the mother didn't protest at the man snatching away her child, but Chiyo knew she'd have several choice words for him later if the glare sent his way was any indication. The way Toshinori winced and trembled in place seemed to confirm it. Perhaps this was Toshinori's kid after all. No random stranger would ever stop a mother from dressing down their child in such a physical way unless they were stupid or a part of their family. Obviously, Toshinori wasn't blood-related to the Midoriya child, but perhaps he was involved with the boy's mother. The very thought of All Might in a relationship seemed strange to Chiyo, but he was going to retire within another year or 3. He had said so himself. Maybe he was just getting ready for that civilian life. Hagari was tense. He didn't like dealing with angry people, women least of all. Nor did he fare particularly well talking to angry parents after Yue had to call them up and inform them their child had blown something up in the support department and had to be sent to recovery girl's office. Still, he mustered up the courage to try and defuse the situation, offering a distraction. Well, why don't we see if Nezu wants to tutor the kid? He's a licensed educator, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind teaching your boy. Despite the tense atmosphere, Chiyo noticed with some small satisfaction that Powerloader directed that statement at All Might, who in usual form was oblivious to it all. That could work, All Might admitted, rubbing a finger across his angular chin. His eyes widened, and he quickly turned to the confused Midoriya matriarch. Ah, Nezu is the principal of UA. He's smart, certainly as smart as him. He motioned downwards towards Izuku. He blushed and looked away. Chiyo rolled her eyes at the lackluster explanation. But she had to admit it wasn't a terrible idea. He could spend much of his day at UA. And then immediately after his tutoring was over, he'd be able to roll down towards the nurse's office for measurements and checkups from herself or go to the design studio to work on his code with Powerloader. Nodding, she decided to speak in agreement. With All Might, she deflated a bit internally. Agreeing with All Might twice in one day. She was getting dizzy. I concur with All Might, she began, shooting a glare at the man when he stared back in surprise. Nezu is an exemplary scholar, and I can see no one better to tutor your son. He'll probably make him perform some sort of test before he agrees, but it is a good idea. Midoriya can spend his days at UA going to school, and then stay a bit later to work on his arms. Can I meet with Nezu? The mother asked, looking between the 3 adults. She allowed herself a small smile when she was met with nods all around. I'm certain that Nezu will be overjoyed to have someone new to play chess with, All Might declared, shooting the shuddering Powerloader an apologetic glance. The support hero had never once beaten Nezu at a game, and had lost quite a lot of money as a result. All seemed to agree though, and after a few more affirmations and a quick check on the time, the party of 5 were leisurely walking through UAS halls towards the principal's office to meet with the mouse bear thing that served as UAS academic leader. All Might's grin was just a bit wider than normal as they marched through the white walkways. No one had ever beaten Nezu in a game of chess before, but Toshinori was certain if anybody could do it, it'd be Midoriya. That messy green hair hid a powerful brain underneath it. The battle of wits would be legendary. A quick trek to the principal's office and one explanation later, and Nezu had quickly agreed to their request, with his usual caveat, of course, a game of chess. By now, the board had been set upon on the principal's far too large for his size desk, and everyone gathered in the room was watching the ongoing match with rapt attention, no one making a single utterance to interrupt the silence. Even the boy's mother was deathly silent, though it was clear she was unsure as to why. No one could blame her. She'd never heard of Nezu before, and as such, it was completely understandable that she'd have no idea just how significant a game of chess could be. Nezu's quirk, high spec, allowed the animal to kick his mind into overdrive, its processing power comparable to that of a supercomputer. Scratch that. If Nezu had to outthink a supercomputer, he could do it. The machine wouldn't be able to keep up with the animal's mind. While his quirk was technically active at all times, Nezu was able to really push things into high gear if he needed more processing power. The cost of doing so, however, was a headache. It was like flooding a car's engine with nitrous. Doing so repeatedly would result in worse and worse headaches. The game had been going on for 16 turns now. Nezu was well known for crushing people in 9. Make no mistake, the quirked animal was still winning. He had more pieces on the board than Izuku did at this point, but the animal was never able to put the boy in check and had even made a mistake when he got frustrated and tried to bait the teen into unfavorably moving his pieces by threatening his defensive line with a rook. This left an opening on Nezu's side of the board, and Midoriya sacrificed his own queen to take out Nezu's. Obviously, Nezu was able to quickly take out Midoriya's piece with his king, but the teen didn't seem to particularly mind that. His strategy was unusual, judging by the way the quirked animal was rubbing small circles into his forehead and wincing slightly. The animal couldn't figure it out either. The green-haired teen was simultaneously not taking the game seriously at all, while also managing to prolong it. He was sacrificing pieces left and right, making illogical moves just to snag an unimportant piece from Nezu's board, but somehow managed to keep just enough of his own pieces around to protect his king. The deal had been pretty simple at first. Nezu agreed to tutor the boy if he played a game of chess with him and lasted longer than 10 moves. Nezu additionally added on the dreaded promise he allotted to everyone he played against, laughing gleefully whilst proclaiming he'd fulfill any request the child had if he could actually beat him in chess. A favor from Principal Nezu. That kind of power could topple governments. So, if I knock over your king, IG get anything I want from you? The boy asked, while the chimera smiled sadistically. Indeed, anything at all. I will do my utmost best to fulfill your request, with no restrictions. Well, beyond illegal things of course, but it's not technically illegal if you don't get caught. Right now, Powerloader was actually unsure about the outcome of the game and was silently dreading the idea of Nezu owing someone a favor, even to the wheelchair-bound sunshine child before him. Izuku was very close to being thrown down into check, as Knight and another rook were menacing both sides of the board, and Izuku's king was effectively immobilized in place. All the greenette was doing was making sure Nezu couldn't move his rook away to reposition and attack his king. Nor was he allowing the animal to move any other pieces into the area. Nezu kept pressing onwards, however, taking piece by piece, losing some in the process, but overall he was gaining ground. It took an eternity, 23 entire moves worth of it, but Izuku was finally placed into check. He could definitely move his king out of the way, but Nezu's other pieces would be able to swoop down and throw him into a definitive checkmate. The quirked animal would have smiled, but Izuku was beaming. It was as if he knew something the animal didn't. But that couldn't be it. The boy was bluffing, smiling in the face of danger just like his idol, All Might. The wheelchair-bound teen opened his mouth to speak to his opponent, before cocking his head to the side and casting his gaze behind the animal with wide, fearful eyes. You and Mr. Principal. Who's the naked girl looking at us from the W window? He stuttered, eyes constantly darting away from the window in the room but consistently returning to sneak another peek. In unison, every single head turned around, wondering who would do such a thing, only to find nothing at all in the window. The sound of a shocked gasp coming from Nezu drew everyone's gaze back down towards the board. Nezu's king was knocked over, and the culprit was none other than Midoriya's own nervous system. The teen had rocketed a tendril out of his neck and toppled the custom-carved marble piece over, leaving a small fleck of blood upon the clean white surface. Shiyu raised her old eyebrows in surprise. Powerloader's mouth dropped open in shock and All Might was doing his level best to hold in laughter, while the teen's mom seemed utterly incredulous, clearly unable to comprehend her son cheating in such a blatant manner. Mirth-filled green orbs connected to the principal's beady black eyes, an unspoken challenge thrown out between the two. I know about your quirk, Nezu. It is quite literally impossible for someone to beat you in a game of chess. High-spec turns you into a literal supercomputer. You can analyze every move I make and come up with the perfect counter. When we agreed to the bet though, I never said I'd beat you, just that I'd knock over your king. The boy gloated, smirking at the quirked animal. Izuku, his mother shouted, sending a withering glare his way. That's cheating. To his credit, the boy smiled sheepishly and met his mother's eyes. Well, why yes, but it was the only possible real choice. The sole winning move. You can't beat Nezu, it's just not possible. Not without reading his mind or anything. Perhaps if one we. The sound of clapping cut off the boy's mumbling storm before it could start, as Nezu himself finally snapped out of the miniature stupor he'd been placed in. Hauling his small, furry body up onto the table, the animal plodded over to Izuku's side and gave the teen a small bow. Powerloader fell over. Quite right on all accounts, Mr. Midoriya. It is impossible to beat me in a game of chess, for reasons you've already mentioned. As such, the only way to beat one such as myself is, indeed, to cheat. Well played. Izuku beamed. Nezu seemed happy, and the rest of the room wasn't entirely sure if they should be mortified, proud, or distraught. I'd be more than happy to tutor a bright mind such as yourself. Mortification it was, then. Nezu no. Nezu yes. Aizawa slammed his head into the desk and groaned, silently debating the pros and cons of quitting his job halfway through the school day. He didn't know how, when, or why, but some middle schooler had been taken under the principal's wing about a month back and was being privately tutored by the quirked animal. This wouldn't be a problem normally, if not for the fact that most students Nezu taught required extensive therapy after 2 or so lessons. Whatever the hell this middle schooler was, Aizawa wasn't entirely sure it was human in nature. In any case, Nezu had been corrupting the youth into his twisted services, and was already creating far more havoc than normal. See, Nezu didn't like walking. His legs were small and Yue had steps designed for humans. For him, the already expansive campus was labyrinthian. He usually just stayed in his office and occasionally demanded a sacrifice be sent there in the form of a student or two to torture for his own amusement. If he wanted to leave his office, a teacher was usually called up so he could hitch a ride on their shoulders. Sadly, the kid he'd decided to tutor had a wheelchair. It was a simple wheelchair too, until Powerloader started tinkering with it and tricked it out. The new one was pretty cool looking for a wheelchair, Aizawa had to admit. bigger rims that were nice and shiny. Hell, there was even a TV that doubled as a portable touchscreen laptop attached to the side that could swing out in front of the teen's view if he pressed a button on the chair's arm. And the seat itself seemed overly plush and disgustingly comfortable. If Izawa had a soul and a sense of humor, the All Might bumper stickers the child stuck to the back of his whip as he referred to it might have been funny. As fate would have it, Izawa did not have a sense of humor. Unfortunately, Nezu did, even though his sense of humor was derived from sadistic tendencies and an innate desire to sow chaos and confusion. He was also on very good terms with the wheelchair-bound child despite the fact that, to the best of Izawa's knowledge, they'd only met about a month and a half back when the animal agreed to tutor him. The two got along like a house on fire. So, when Nezu asks green-haired Mini Nezu if he can modify the wheelchair for whatever sick, twisted desires he has that day, the child doesn't say no. And when Nezu asks to play dress-up with the boy himself, he doesn't refuse either. This led Izawa to his current predicament, trying to get through homeroom period so he could nap for 5 minutes before the next class came in, getting interrupted by Nezu. See, now that Nezu had a willing participant in his chaos-causing ways, one with a wheelchair no less, Nezu was mobile. No longer was he rightfully confined to his office. That dreaded room teachers would occasionally throw students inside as a sacrifice of sorts to appease his sick, twisted desires for mind games. Now he prowled around UAS campus looking for students to terrorize like a shark smelling blood in the water. Case in point, he was fairly certain he'd heard the quirked animal attempting to convince the boy to run over a gaggle of students a few days ago in the cafeteria, and when that didn't work, Izawa was quite certain he witnessed the principal pull out a fishing rod with an All Might action figure attached to the line and dangled it in front of the greenette's view for motivation. Just earlier today, Present Mike apparently threw himself out the window when Nezu came rolling down the hallway, and now that Izawa could see what he'd done to the wheelchair and the boy himself, the underground hero couldn't really find it in him to fault his noisy companion. "Greetings, mortals," Nezu gleefully shouted. Amajaki, one of his second-year students with a large amount of potential, fainted on the spot. Nezu chuckled. The quirked animal had decided to modify the wheelchair by painting every square inch of it black with splatters of red to mimic blood, and had glued human skulls with a statistically high likelihood of being real to the arms. The spokes on his wheels, femurs, the backrest. Yep, there's a ribcage tied to it. Handlebars, 2 separate segments of a human spine. To really top it all off, he'd bolted wooden poles to the back of the chair and speared a couple skulls and rusty iron spikes through it in some horrendous, macabre effigy. Nezu himself was situated upon a plush purple pillow resting in the teen's lap, a smile on his face and black, beady eyes wide with unrestrained joy. The quirked animal had foregone his usual suit in exchange for blood-red robes with the faint image of an imposing green skull upon the chest, and had similarly dressed the boy. Sadly, while Nezu appeared to be the very picture of death, the teen's shy, highly embarrassed face slightly ruined the imposing image the quirked animal was trying to project. "Nezu," Izawa drawled, already dreading whatever was about to spew forth from the animal's mouth. "Why are you terrifying my class? I'm just getting in the Halloween spirit, Izawa. You should join in the festivities. Halloween is both an American holiday, and not for another 2 weeks." "Irrelevant," Izawa groaned and tried to will away the migraine forming in his head. "What do you want?" he asked, hoping to get this nightmare over with as painlessly as possible. "It is time for the blood sacrifices, Izawa. I have arrived to retrieve Mirio Tagata, Tamaki Amajiki, and Nejire Hado from your care." Izawa was a logical man. He believed in getting the most he could out of a situation while inputting as little effort as possible. Questioning Nezu was pointless. From the animal's smug-looking face on the child's lap, he was well aware of the situation he presented himself in. If Nezu wanted to perform blood sacrifices, he wasn't going to question it. Izawa was going to ask the only real question that mattered, in as few words as possible. Why? Nailed it. To prove they are qualified for the title of UAS Big 3 in the following Earth rotation, I must witness and furthermore test their abilities in the arena. Those 3 students of his did show a great amount of potential. And it was true that they likely were Big 3 material. You didn't just get that title for your performance in the sports festival, though, or through your grades. You had to be individually evaluated by Nezu and were then run through a litany of tests against other students to determine your qualifications. Things like an obstacle course, fighting the current Big 3, a Zumba class, etc. It must be time to begin the selection process for next year. Fine, take them and go. Tagata, carry out Amajiki. Eraserhead emotionlessly drawled, almost feeling a twinge of pity in his gut as his blonde-haired student reluctantly walked over to his unconscious friend, tossing him over his muscular shoulder like a sack of potatoes. Almost. Nejire seemed far too happy about this situation. She practically skipped up towards the cultist icon that was the child's wheelchair and gave an exaggerated bow. "Blood for the blood god." "What?" Nezu nodded solemnly. "Skulls for the skull throne." The quirked animal spoke, almost reverently. Aizawa was too old for this shit. All right, Sonny, you sure you're up for this? There's no going back once this installation procedure takes place. Shio figured it'd be a common courtesy to at least offer the child the option of backing out, even though she understood what his response would be. To be fair, if she were in his position, she'd probably be eager to just get it all over with too. They'd finally designed a few prototype arms for the child to fiddle around with, which meant that all Izuku needed to do was finally undergo the installation procedure of his spinal jacks so he could get things moving along. Truthfully, it had taken longer than any of them would have predicted to perform this feat, a full 3.5 months. Things weren't exactly on schedule. Still, it was better to be safe than rush things along. Shio brought in a few neurologists and some quirk specialists to take a look at the boy's condition, and they'd managed to acquire a decent amount of data. Thanks to this new information, they'd successfully discovered a method through which they could restore some functionality to Izuku's body, though he'd still be unable to move any of his limbs. They'd designed something called a control box that would be implanted directly inside of Izuku like an artificial organ they'd then connect his organic organs to. Finally, they'd plug the device into his remaining, functional nervous system. In theory, it'd allow the boy to have a bit more control over his breathing, and he'd regain the ability to control his bladder and other bodily functions. The boy was quite elated to hear that news. There was another reason for the control box, though. Usable space was a legitimate problem with Midoriya's design, considering his spine was relatively sleek. Indeed, the whole contraption was designed with the explicit purpose of being able to hide beneath a baggy shirt. Computers had come a long way, but they hadn't quite yet reached the point where they could squeeze all the required circuit boards inside a device not much thicker than the average human spine. Instead, Izuku suggested shoving the computer inside of the control box and installing another jack inside him for the mechanical spine to link up to that. As far as Recovery Girl was aware, no one had ever gotten a computer installed inside of them, but the Greenette was inventing a lot of firsts here anyways. As such, his suggestion was tentatively agreed to. That left only one more step: the creation of his mechanical spine. Powerloader had already invented a prototype that Izuku could utilize once these jacks were installed, but until then, it was pretty useless. The device itself wasn't anything like the spine it claimed to be, just a giant eyesore of a box with a single mechanical tentacle sticking out the top like some horrific jack-in-the-box. They'd tried and failed to utilize brainwave scanning equipment to allow him to move the device, and while that solution did work, it was exceptionally slow. The device had a magnificent 4-second time delay between thought and action, which was genuinely unacceptable. Even a 1-second delay wasn't alright, since in hero work instantaneous movement was all but a necessity. Scratch that. The ability to guess what movements you needed to make before you actually had to perform said movements was a necessity. That in and of itself was already hard. Stacking on an extra 4 seconds made it impossible. Midoriya's proposal for creating wiring from his own nervous tissue was all but a necessity. Hopefully, creating those wires would be sufficient for transferring information to and from the device. Harvesting a nervous system wasn't a medical procedure, and the ethics were debatable at best. It only relieved Chiyo's headache slightly that her friend in the support department was facing a similar ethical, technical nightmare. See, UA was doing their best to try and cram a power supply into Izuku's chassis, but it was proving more troublesome than initially thought. Midoriya was distraught to know that he could not, in fact, install a nuclear reactor in his spine. After a 15-minute-long lecture from the Greenette, he'd calmed down enough to learn that the nice government employee wasn't implying he lacked the intelligence to perform such an action, but was telling him that, legally speaking, he wasn't allowed to. Powerloader was currently searching for alternative sources of power that were compact enough to be installed within the device, as well as ones that were powerful enough to not need a constant supply of energy. In response to her earlier question, Izuku gave Chiyo a determined nod, craning his neck sideways to observe the camera feed that was trained on his back. The team wanted to stay awake for his entire operation, much to Chiyo's horror. The horror lessened significantly when she was informed by the boy's mother that his quirk actually allowed him to nullify pain signals from reaching his brain, and that wasn't just a side effect of his paralysis. Well, that was still a side effect of his paralysis, but he'd had immunity to pain before his accident as well. Now that Chiyo was seeing his whole body naked, she had to say, she wasn't particularly happy. No child should have such an egregious amount of scars littering his body. Everything was there. Stab marks, sloughed off skin, burns, a few that looked like explosions went off directly against the flesh, chemical scarring, you name it, the kid had it. She'd asked the mother about them when it became apparent Midoriya himself had no interest in speaking about, and learned Izuku abused his immunity to pain to become popular in middle school, foolishly allowing anyone to do whatever they wanted to his body and shrugging it off like it was nothing. She made a mental note to request that his old school be put under investigation. It was an educational institution's job to ensure their students never engaged in reckless use of their quirks. She'd have yelled at the boy, but he was paralyzed. Shio figured he understood why what he did was stupid by this point, and even then, 6-year-olds were never really known for their cognitive processes. Throwing superpowers into the mix was just asking for trouble. Whatever drove him to believe that being a glorified punching bag was an acceptable way to make friends, she'd investigate later. Right now she had surgery to perform. After 2 extra surgeries to acquire more nerve tissue and a modification to the boy's implanted control box, things were finally ready to be tested. It had taken them 6 months to get here, but they'd done it. "All right," Powerloader exclaimed with a little clap of his hands, holding up what looked like a bundle of flexible PVC tubing. "All we've got to do is place this on your back and the sensors should detect those jacks we've installed in you, with the connection being made automatically. You'll just have to extend your nervous system in there and plug yourself in," he explained, pointing a hand back towards the prototype itself, sitting in all its boxy glory off to the right, one sole tentacle suspended above it from a strap attached to the ceiling. While the greenette nodded in determination, All Might looked confused and slightly disappointed. That's it." Shio glared at the man. "Were you expecting a smokescreen and some giant, overly complicated machine with flashing lights to install the arms?" Well, yes," the skeleton flushed. "Not everything need be so complex." "Toshinori," Powerloader chided, calmly moving over to Izuku's side and pulling back the collar of his shirt to expose the metal jack. "You missed all the flashing lights when the kid had his surgery." All Might's hand clutched his side as the man grimaced. "Yes, well, surgery's not something I had a particular interest in seeing." No offense, my boy." "None taken," Izuku readily shouted, before his head tilted to the side slightly. "You know, I just thought of a problem." Powerloader had paused on the table beside Midoriya, halting the process of leveling the tube to his neck. "Yes, once the final thing's completed, I'm going to be punching holes in my shirts every time I extend the arms out, aren't I?" The support course teacher arched an eyebrow. "You think of the strangest things at times, Midoriya." While she couldn't see from her position, Chio got the distinct impression Midoriya was blushing. "Ever supportive," All Might chimed in with his boisterous brand of reassurance. "Fear not, young Midoriya. The ladies love it when the hero tears off their shirt," the blonde boasted, shooting the boy 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. Just to really sell it, he bulked his body up with his quirk, stretching the baggy yellow suit he wore to its very limits. The child squeaked in response. Inko, sitting off to the side away from all the unusual machinery, was quick to cheer in support of All Might, her eyes roaming all over the muscular man's physique. "Ooh, he's right, Izuku. Think of all the fans you'll get." "Mom," Powerloader rolled his eyes as Midoriya attempted to turtle further into himself, ducking his head down as much as possible. At this point, he was used to the greenette becoming flustered by just about anything really, and attempting to squirrel his head down inside whatever shirt he happened to be wearing that day was par for the course. "Oi, kid, can't plug in your cord if you keep hiding in your shirt now, can I?" "MNGF," the teen eloquently responded, reluctantly popping back out of his shirt to allow the support course teacher access to his jack. The man slowly began lowering the cord down into its socket. "Wait," again, all eyes swiveled back towards All Might, who was staring at Powerloader's actions quite intently. "That's not actually it, is it?" Powerloader wordlessly plugged Midoriya in without further warning. Midoriya's facial features seemed to twitch widely as the device connected to his nervous system, spasming about as though someone was tickling the boy. The device the cord connected to, the giant box with the tentacle jutting out of it, slowly whirred to life. Blue lights lining the side of the contraption flickered as power flowed into the circuits, trailing up to the top of the device. Midoriya's arm, the metal tentacle, twitched as the life-giving electricity flowed through its capacitors, analogous to blood rushing through a vein. The tentacle was approximately 6 feet in length, constructed with 50 separate metal pieces all linked together like plate mail so the machine could maintain flexibility while still retaining enough hardness to protect its delicate inner components. While Midoriya wanted the final version to utilize a strange, spring-like metallic housing of his own design to give himself superior mobility, tensile strength, and dexterity, the current version was stuck at its base length of 6 feet, no more no less. The tip of the device ended in a 3-pronged hand, not too unlike what one would see on one of those claw machines at arcades. His makeshift appendage claws were rather straight though, and when closed, resembled something akin to a pyramid. The tips of the claws had small hinges attached, and with a mental switch could be flipped out to make smaller manipulators appear for tasks that required smaller touches. As the power reached its tips, the pyramid-like structure began to open, like a long-asleep hand finally unclenching. Almost like a snake being charmed from its basket by a flute player, the metal claw slowly waved from side to side as Midoriya stared in awe at the appendage, much like the various adults in the room. Slowly, almost reverently, the tentacle lifted itself out of the various straps keeping it suspended in the air and lowered itself down, reaching out towards Inko with an open claw. In turn, she too reached out like a scared animal, her fingertips earnestly brushing the cold metal clawtips. "It works," she murmured, eyes beginning to brim with tears. "It works." Powerloader grinned, sharing an enthusiastic glance with Chio at the advancement. This, advanced neuroscience created by a 14-year-old child, had the potential to revolutionize modern medicine. He created the very basis for a workaround for paralysis. Midoriya sniffled, the claw quickly retracting and rushing to his face to wipe away the tears that had spilled from his eyes. He didn't even seem to notice that he'd moved the claw in such a way until it was already upon his face, which only caused his wide eyes to release yet more tears. "It works." Toru Hagakure was used to strange things. Being invisible, you got to see plenty of them, especially when people thought you weren't there. When she was 12, it had been her hobby to strip and see just how many places she could wriggle into that she shouldn't have technically been allowed inside. She blamed the hormones. Teenage rebellion was a lot easier when your parents couldn't decide if you weren't actually there or if you were just giving them really good silent treatment. Today was a new experience, however. Toru had only heard about it in passing, tossed around like an expression, seen it described in movies, read about it in books, the whole 9 yards. The sensation of having the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and a sort of tingling sensation rippling across her skin along with a looming sort of dread that just wouldn't go away. Hagakure felt like she was being watched. Perhaps the worst part of it was the fact that she wasn't doing anything particularly unusual. Toru wasn't sure what the entrance exam for UA she would be taking next month was going to be like, but she'd decided to dedicate all her spare time to sneaking about. If she had to fight or outsmart some proctors to get into the hero course, she was going to make damn sure she was at least decent in the realm of sneaking about. To that end, she'd been invading public spaces like this totally nude, and doing her level best to steal little inconsequential things from people without them noticing. A pencil here, a pen there, maybe move the things in front of them around without them taking conscious notice of her presence, like flipping the pages of the book they happened to be reading right under their nose. That last one featured prominently, especially since she had decided to haunt the Mustafu Public Library today. She'd followed a couple in through the automatic doors, and gone about her usual routine. See how much she could move about without getting noticed. The usual pencil thefts, trying to carry books from one end of the library to another without getting spotted. The aforementioned page flipping. Yet about 10 minutes into her exercises, she'd felt that skin-prickling sensation. It typically manifested whenever she'd passed by the high bookshelves and moved into the commons area, filled with various tables and a few computers for the use of the general public. Whenever she entered there, that sensation came back in full, startling her with its intensity. Hagakure had never been watched. Not like this, not even by her own family. She decided she didn't like it. Considering this, she decided to get straight to the bottom of this mystery, putting the books she'd been attempting to cart around the building without being noticed. Toru did away with subtly and waltzed into the commons area with her shoulders squared, immediately feeling the unpleasant sensation of eyes upon her skin. Casting her gaze around the area, she bravely stood her ground and scanned her surroundings, trying to identify the source of the sensation. There was only a small smattering of people in the library at that time, so thankfully she didn't have to find a needle in a haystack. There was a tiny group of 3 young adults, likely college students, grouped together at a cheap wooden table with their heads stuffed inside musty old books, likely trying to read up on a history report or something similar. An elderly couple were seated a few tables away, both quietly reading from the same large tome, and she felt confident in using the term tome thanks to its particularly ancient appearance. A few seats further down was a small girl with what might have been her older sister, the ink on the pages literally popping off the pages and floating before the pair as the younger girl waved her glowing finger around. Blatant public quirk use aside, she still couldn't discern where that sensation was coming from. Off in the corner was a green-haired pine tree of a teenager sitting in a wheelchair, his eyes firmly fixated on the computer he was sat before. From this distance, she couldn't tell exactly what was on the screen, but it seemed like he was reading comic books, or maybe graphic novels. Curiously, he wasn't using his own hands to manipulate the computer's controls. Rather, he seemed to have 2 metal claws jutting out of a box on the back of his wheelchair that he used like hands. A third was peeking out from the bottom of that strange storage container, its claw open wide to reveal a glowing red light in the center. With a frown, Hagakure moved deeper into the commons room to see if she was missing anyone, only to freeze as her eyes trailed back to the greenette's wheelchair-bound form. He wasn't moving. His eyes were still solely fixated on that screen. But that claw of his seemed like it was locked onto Toru's form. As she moved, the damn thing slowly turned to keep her in his sights, even as its user gave no outward acknowledgement of its actions. Wherever she moved, that claw followed. With a frown, the invisible woman decided the direct approach was best for dealing with this situation, steadily approaching the wheelchair-bound boy without further ado. To her small surprise, as she approached, he seemed to perk up once it became clear that Toru was making a beeline straight for him. One of the claws ceased fiddling with the computer's keyboard and moved down to his wheelchair's arm, where it grabbed onto the electric chair's joystick and started turning the seat around for him. Hagakure noticed the teen was perhaps slightly younger than her, given that he was clad in a black seifuku. Curiously, he had popped the collar of his uniform up like a delinquent, which, while an odd-fashioned statement she doubted would fly in the classroom, she had no issue with. His features were a bit plain with his round face, but he did have one unique feature in the form of his freckles, covering both his cheeks in a diamond-like pattern. His eyes were quite expressive as well, emerald irises that complemented the small smile plastered on his face, as well as the deep laugh lines he'd somehow accrued already in life, hinting at just how much he actually smiled. To her surprise, that smile faltered as he turned fully around and looked right at the spot where Hagakure's eyes were. Toru felt her breath hitch as the boy's eyes darted up and down her body at a dizzying pace, a look of utter bewilderment crossing his features. His emerald orbs never seemed to rest in any one location for long, and eventually he shook his head in confusion, one of his metal claws, the one that had been keeping its eye on her, snaking its way around the wheelchair's back to face its master. Must be a malfunction in the visual sensors, he muttered, using another claw to poke and prod the glowing red light at the center of the third. There's no one here. Hi, Toru hesitantly piped up, waving a hand entirely out of habit. The invisible woman took a startled step back when the greenette squeaked and jerked back on the toggle of his wheelchair, reversing the whole thing at a rather remarkable speed straight into the desk supporting the computer behind him. The old flat-screen monitor precariously tattered over the edge of the table before one of his claws contorted itself in an unexpectedly flexible manner and grabbed the screen with surprising deftness, righting the device before it could topple to the ground below. The green-haired boy still looked like he was recovering from a jump scare, taking several deep breaths as the claw that controlled his joystick shot up to clamp on his head in a poor facsimile of someone tugging their hair in frustration. That third claw with the glowing red center had turned itself back upon Toru, however, and she felt that tingling sensation spread through her body once more. Can you see me?" she asked, still unsure of what to make of the situation. He seemed both capable of seeing her while simultaneously acting as though he had no idea her presence existed. The greenette jerked his eyes back up to the exact spot Toru's eyes were, and she felt herself cringing back from the teen as his third claw snaked forward and got precariously close to her personal space, its open aperture roaming up and down her highly uncomfortable body. She'd never felt so naked in her entire life. Before she could voice any complaints, though. "Oh gosh, are you invisible? That's so cool. Is that like a conscious decision on your part, or is it like a mutation? Can you see out of your eyes if they're invisible? Actually, dumb question, I think. Is it? Can you see when you turn invisible? Vision is made when light reaches the eyes. So if you're stopping all the light from reaching your skin to bounce off of you and form a visual of, well, you, then it seems plausible that turning invisible might stop light from entering your eyes since it's actually passing through it and not reaching the visual centers of your brain." "Oh my god," Toru breathed, taking in the rapidly speaking greenette in a whole new light. "You're one of those quirk nerds, aren't you?" Her outburst seemed to make the teen stop his mumbling storm, and he turned a truly impressive shade of red, ducking his head down to avoid her gaze. Well, it's it's a hobby," he weakly defended, finally retracting that claw from inspecting her body. It retreated back to his side, though it still peeked out from behind the wheelchair and kept its red-lensed aperture firmly fixated on her position. The two lapsed into a brief moment of silence, both unsure of where to go from there. Toru shuffled her feet while the wheelchaired boy idly fiddled with his joystick, moving the thing back and forth like a rocking chair. "So," Hagakure started, drawing the greeneate's vision back to her face, which was still an odd experience. Can you actually see me?" Toru watched the gears turning in his head for a solid 2 seconds, before the vestiges of his incomprehension washed from his face with his loud exclamation of, "Oh." His third claw moved forward once more, slithering forwards through the air like a snake and coming to rest a respectful distance away from Toru's face. I can't technically see you actually, but my arms can. Kinda, sort of, mostly." Toru cocked an eyebrow, as though he could see the expression. The teen raised two of his claws up as though imitating a gesture of surrender. "It's the arms. I've thermal vision. Third W with the red light," he stuttered out, Toru just gleaning the required information from his explanation. She leaned her head to the side. "But, you're looking at me. So's the claw, but you're doing it too. And neural link. It's a new feature, working pretty well, but it's a bit disorienting with I can see you with the claw's vision, but when I look with my actual eyes, there's just, and nothing. It's giving me really odd double vision, actually. As everything finally started to catch up with Toru's mind, she slowly covered her breasts and privates with her arms. The boy cocking his head to the side in confusion at the action did not reassure her in the slightest. Are you okay? Why are you doing that? He inclined his head in Toru's direction. Why, you can see me. Yeah. Hagakure further turtled in on herself in a desperate attempt to cover up. The greenette's eyes widened to a comical degree as he finally understood what was happening. Much to Toru's relief. Sorry. Crack. There you are too. Koharu. Hagakure's voice died out as she stared at the figure standing next to her daughter. Or, perhaps more accurately, towering over her. Now, Koharu wasn't exactly a stranger to the weirdness her daughter often came home with. Her hair was continually graying thanks to all the stories Toru came bounding in through their front door with, typically of the debatably legal variety. However, her weirdness only extended to stories. Things she'd seen, heard thanks to her invisibility. This would probably be the first time she physically brought something back. However, standing next to her daughter was a green-haired teenage boy in a seifuku, suspended several feet off the ground by two strange, metallic tentacles with three-pronged claws that seemed to jut out from his spine. Two other tentacles were poised over his shoulder, their claws open wide to reveal glowing red lights in the center. One was firmly focused on the position her daughter happened to be standing in, and the other seemed to wave about in the breeze like a snake, focused solely on herself. Another thing about her daughter that was unusual, she was fully clothed. Toru typically went about her escapades by leaving their apartment in the buff as it were. But at some point she'd stopped and managed to snag a particularly long brown jacket from somewhere to cover up, the coat trailing midway down to her calves. Hi mom. This is, Midoriya. He needs your help. I really don't. The boy meekly stuttered, drawing a raised eyebrow of surprise from Koharu. Now that she actually looked at him, she realized he seemed rather limp from his position, almost as though he was literally hanging from his strange quirk. Additionally, he was bleeding from his nose, quite profusely. In fact, Koharu bit back a wince as she took in his bloodied face. It had definitely been broken. His nose was offset to the left at an odd angle and would definitely need to be reset. Her daughter was lucky she worked as a nurse. Ignoring his odd quirk, Koharu stepped to the side and beckoned inside, doing her best not to let the surprise on her face show when his metallic footfalls barely made much noise on their laminate flooring. If anything, it seemed the teen was stepping around carefully so as not to even scratch the surface. Considering how rugged those claw tips looked, she imagined that was a very real possibility. Takakir broke his own nose, her daughter offered by way of explanation, which didn't really answer the real questions going through her head at the moment. It's really not a big deal. I could have gotten it fixed elsewhere. He most certainly could have. Which was partly why she was so confused. Koharu watched with wide eyes as this Midoriya boy stomped into their living room, a simple thing with beige walls and simple, exceedingly cushy furniture. Just wait there for one moment, Midoriya. I'll go fetch my first aid kit. I'll help. Her daughter chimed, skipping in to step right behind her as she maneuvered around the living room to reach the kitchen. So, Koharu drawled, well aware of her daughter's eyes upon her as she rummaged through the cabinets for her kit. Want to tell me why you dragged that poor boy up to our apartment for medical assistance rather than taking him to an actual doctor's office? He broke his nose cause of me. Koharu released a deep, bone-weary sigh as the implications set in. Were you pretending to be people's inner voice again? If you told that boy to do something reckless, Toru, I swear, He can see me, her daughter interrupted, grinding all of Koharu's thoughts to a halt. Slowly, she turned her disbelieving gesture towards Toru, who moved the shoulders of her jacket up and down in the approximation of a shrug. It's his claws. Says they let him see heat signatures or something and he'd been watching me. Apparently, he didn't realize I was naked, so. She trailed off, leaving her mother completely in the dark. Seeing her look of incomprehension, Toru cast her gaze around the kitchen and found a frying pan left unattended on the stovetop, which she quickly picked up and mimed the action of slamming it over her eyes. As the pan lowered, Hagakure was greeted by the sight of her mother suppressing a wince. Yeah, she sighed. That's kinda why I brought him here. Felt like I owed him free treatment, at least. With a slow nod, Koharu accepted her daughter's explanation and continued rummaging for the kit, eventually pulling out the white bag with its iconic red cross after a few seconds. Well, I certainly can't tell him to leave without fixing him up now that you've brought him here, she rationalized, stepping around the floating coat and re-entering the living room. Midoriya was still there, still limply suspended from 3 of his 4 arms, the final one hovering open next to his face and staring at whatever he himself was looking at on their mantelpiece. At the moment, his back was actually turned to Koharu when she discovered that there were actually 4 circular holes cut into the back of his shirt for the arms to protrude. Midoriya was it. "I've got my kit here," she called, repressing a flinch as his 4th claw swiveled around, its red-eyed gaze coming to rest upon her. Midoriya's claws raised him off the ground a few more inches and turned the boy around, his body swaying limply with the motion. Now that she paid attention to it, she noticed that even his arms were particularly limp and unmoving, slapping against his body as it moved around. Okay. Sorry, I was just looking at the pictures. That one's my favorite." He smiled shyly, pointing to a picture on the mantelpiece with his claw, closing most of it save one finger to crudely point at the image in question. Koharu snorted. It was a particular image in a collage of photos, all from the yearbook pictures her daughter's school would take each year. The latest yearbook photo was actually blank because her daughter was sick that day and couldn't make it in for the photo, but Toru still ended up in the yearbook. Her daughter wasn't actually in the photo. It was just a picture of their pre-selected background without anything else in it. But the school's principal had a sense of humor and emailed that to her with the explanation that she could pretend her daughter was in it. She proudly showed that photo off to anyone when she wanted a quick laugh. "It is a good one," she conceded, taking a seat in one of her recliners and gesturing for Midoriya to come closer. "The background really brings out her eyes, don't you think?" "Definitely." Raising an eyebrow at noticing the boy had yet to actually come closer so she could fix him, she beckoned him over once more after fishing out a bottle of pain relievers from the kit. "Come on, the quicker you take these the quicker I can fix your nose. You don't want that to heal in the wrong position, right?" He seemed confused for a second before understanding washed over his features, and he stepped forwards into Koharu's range. Or, more accurately, his claws simply leaned him closer to Koharu without actually lifting themselves off the ground in any way. That's not necessary. And my quirk is basically an immunity to pain. I didn't even know my nose was broken until Hakeger P pointed it out. You can just do whatever you need." Koharu turned around and raised an eyebrow at her daughter, who had finally decided to exit the kitchen and joined them in the living room. The jacket's collar bent awkwardly, which she presumed to be a nod of agreement. With a shrug of her own, Koharu reached forward and tapped on the greenette's nose with just a bit more force than necessary, her eyes widening in surprise when he didn't even flinch. He gave a small, apologetic smile. If anything, that just made the situation all the more confusing. She thought the claws were his quirk, or at least part of it, and they still must have been, but she had no idea how pain immunity led to control over a metal clawsuit. Deciding to just get things over with, Koharu tapped his nose again and activated her quirk, the woman's fingers emitting a small shower of dazzling spark-like lights. She had to repress the urge to laugh as the teen's emerald orbs went cross-eyed as he tried to focus on the lights. "What's that?" Koharu examined the cartilage and nasal bones, silently pleased the break was so clean. "Oh, nothing to worry about, sweetie. Just my quirk. I can make small sections of people's skin turn invisible with a touch. It's quite handy for my work as a nurse." "Though wow," he cheered, not reacting in the slightest as she snapped his nose back into the correct position with an audible crack that had even her daughter wincing. "Can you, control how much you make invisible? Or does it just vanish everything except for the bones? Does vanishing muscle take more effort than skin? Is there any difference at all?" What's your husband's quirk? Anything to do with the manipulation of his own skin? Color perhaps? Is it funk?" The Midoriya boy's rambling was finally cut off, much to Koharu's shock, by a book bouncing off the top of his head. When she turned around to stare at her daughter in disbelief, she was only met with another pantomime shrug. "Trust me, blunt force trauma is the only thing that stops him rambling." A sheepish chuckle stopped her from reprimanding Toru. It's all right, as she's not wrong. I get lost in my head sometimes. More like all the time. You barely know me." "Yeah, and in the 30 minutes I have you've speculated, out loud, about the possibilities of skinning my thighs to make an invisible skin suit. And no, I said we might be able to take a skin graft from your thigh and form a cell C culture from that, so we could grow you a costume. Then you wouldn't have to be naked to use your quirk. That's what I said." It's not." Koharu felt a headache coming on. "No, scratch that, a migraine." Toru was supposed to leave the crazy outside, not drag it in. Almost sheepishly, Koharu cut into the conversation she didn't really want to know the details behind. Mind holding still for a second, Midoriya. "I need to apply this splint," she muttered, refining the hinge-like piece of plastic she had prepared to stick on his face. She would have just done it while he was talking, but considering his face kept contorting in the most exaggerated expressions possible, she didn't want to risk it. Why yeah. Sorry. The boy settled once more. Koharu rolled her eyes and set about applying the brace. Sadly, curiosity eventually got the best of her seconds after she'd stuck the thing on and the room lapsed into uncomfortable silence. So, what's this about a skin suit? The greenette attempted to turtle his way inside his shirt. Well, you see, I'm a bit of a gadget designer. Sometimes I just hypothesize out loud. He said that since hair cells are dead, and my hair's invisible, that means it's likely my skin would continue to be invisible even if removed from my body. From that, he started talking about me wearing a sack of my own skin as a hero costume. As strange as that is, I'd be far more comfortable with that than you running around your classmates totally naked. Koharu honestly answered, contemplating the idea. She'd known about her daughter's hero ambitions for a while now. She also knew that meant her daughter wanted to go into a profession where her uniform would be a total lack of clothing so she could fully utilize her quirk. As a mother, that upset her for a number of reasons. She'd considered things her daughter could wear as a costume, but honestly the skin thing was probably the first functional idea she'd heard. Her daughter was right though. That was a little weird. Toru sighed. He's applying for UA apparently, support course. Koharu wasn't really surprised by that. Yep, the boy cheered, reeling himself back and flexing his mechanical arms around in a complicated pattern. Built these myself. Well, someone else built them, but I designed them. I'm thinking you should incorporate a face shield to be honest. Toru snarked. That way you can't hurt yourself again. I said I was fine. Your bloody nose said otherwise. I personally no recovery girl. I would have been fine. So now you admit you weren't fine. Koharu's head kept snapping back and forth as she struggled to keep up with the conversation. In some small sense, she felt pity for the boy. Toru only snarked like that when she felt bad. But Midoriya didn't know that. Tuning back into the conversation, she witnessed Midoriya open his mouth to say something, only for an alarm to distract all parties present. Beep, beep, beep. Toru and her mother startled at the sudden noise, but Izuku merely widened his eyes and brought one of his arms up to his face, a panel flipping up on the metal coils to show him some sort of display beneath it. It appears that I need to go. My harness is about to run out of power. Toru's own eyes widened in surprise. Honestly, she hadn't even considered how he powered those things. Now that it was on her mind though, she was very curious. What, that thing uses diesel? The boy sighed. Remember that huge box on the back of my wheelchair? Toru nodded. Yeah, that's a battery. I'm still working on getting a power supply built into my arms. But until then I'm kinda limited in my range of motion. The arms can only hold like 13 minutes of power at the moment. They wouldn't let me put a nuclear reactor in the harness for some reason. Toru and her mother both sweat dropped. Well, it was nice to meet you, Midoriya. It's good to know my daughter has already snagged someone from the support department to assist her. Koharu smiled. Mom, we don't even know if we'll pass the entrance exams. Oh, pish posh. He built a giant pair of robot arms and you're invisible. I'm sure whatever they throw at you for the exam won't be too difficult. Again, Izuku flushed and ducked his head. Well, I've actually been entered as a recommendation student. All you have to do to qualify for the support department though is show sufficient mechanical prowess to power loader and pass an exam. I probably wouldn't have had much trouble with that. See, that's the kind of confidence you ought to embody. Negative thoughts will only lead to negative outcomes. Her mother sent a grin in Toru's direction, sending an apologetic glance towards Hagakure. Izuku maneuvered his tentacles to carry him back towards their front door, each claw step upon their floor unnaturally light. With surprising deftness, he'd manipulated their front door open with a claw and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, closing it behind himself. Koharu waited 5 seconds before grinning at her daughter, ready to drop the snarkiness now that your object of guilt is gone. Instantly, the coat covering her daughter sagged and swayed side to side, a surefire gesture that meant Toru was writhing around in embarrassment. He saw me. Naked. It wasn't guilt. It was. Outrage. The woman smirked knowingly. And I'm sure that your decision to run around nude in a world full of people with vision-based quirks had absolutely no bearing on this situation. Perhaps if you didn't go about in full commando this could have been averted. I have to train somehow. Skinny dipping is training. That was one time. The older woman raised an eyebrow. 2 times. Toru eventually grumbled, the sleeves of the jacket crossing and covering up her abdomen. 2 times a month maybe. Koharu mumbled, walking over to their entranceway and staring out the peephole. She couldn't see the boy anywhere on the small patch of street visible from their apartment, but he must have been somewhere. Shrugging, she turned around to face her still nervously swaying daughter. You always meet the strangest people, sweetie. Toru whined. Mom, what? It's true. Usually you're just telling me about all the strange people you see, but I figured you'd drag someone home eventually. I really should have expected the tentacles. What? Her mother shrugged. You're the one who regularly goes streaking through the city. If exhibitionism came that easily, I figured your other tastes would run a bit weird. Mom. Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.